In the flickering torchlight of Constantinople's towering halls, echoes of emperors and whispers of ancient prayers linger in the marble air. But what happens when you strip away the war, the politics, and the power? You're left with a tale. So quietly rich, so deeply layered, it can only be told when the world has gone to sleep. If you adore unraveling dusty scrolls of forgotten empires as the night unfolds, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more sleepy journeys into boring but mesmerizing history. Close your eyes and let the empire that outlived Rome soothe you to sleep. You begin at the old eastern edge of the Roman world, where sea breezes sweep across a narrow strait and whales sometimes surface in the shadow of walls. The city before you is not yet a legend, not yet an emblem of centuries of resilience, but it is already ambitious in the quiet, practical way that shapes history as much as any battlefield. When Constantine refounded Byzantium as Constantinople, he was not merely erecting monuments or shifting a throne. He was recalculating the arithmetic of empire. The city's strength lay in geometry and geography, a triangle of land flanked by water on two sides and a land wall on the third, a strait that joined to seas. A midpoint between north and south, east and west, the military frontiers and the granaries. You can almost see the ledgers in the air, lists of ships, grain measurements, troop allocations, bridge timbers, and stone quotas, all converging on a place that promised control through logistics rather than spectacle. The foundations here were poured as much in numbers as in mortar. What gives this city its staying power is not mystical destiny, but a collection of unglamorous decisions. Roads were repaired along the Balkans to bring timber and fodder to the capital. Docks were laid to regulate cargoes arriving from the Black Sea and the Aegean. New aqueduct channels were measured and cut with the patience of surveyors who would never be known to history. The aqueduct of Valens, striding over the city's undulating hills, was less a symbol than a supply pipe. A long answer to the practical question of how to keep fountains flowing and baths warm in neighborhoods where thousands lived tightly packed. Cisterns multiplied, vaulted, bricked, and lined to ensure resilience during sieges and droughts. The neighborhoods beneath your feet were mapped and remapped, drawn into districts for tax and order, for guild supervision and grain distribution, for the assigning of watch patrols that would pass lantern to lantern through the darkness. If you listen, you can hear the whispers of paperwork. The Eastern Roman Empire did not rebrand itself as Byzantine overnight. It lived in the continuity of documents. Edicts still used Latin phrasing long after Greek echoed in the streets. Offices were recorded with titles inherited from Old Rome, even as new functions formed around them. Prefectures drew mosaics of provinces into administrative clusters. Dioceses coordinated the absorption of taxes in kind and coin. Regional commanders counted spears and harnesses, javelins and grain sacks, all meant to move as scheduled pieces in a large, somewhat creaky machine. That machine was designed not for glory, but for endurance. It needed stable gold and Constantines. Solid coin whose weight and purity were guarded through rituals of minting gave the empire a dependable unit for decades longer than most currencies enjoy. The solidus was a simple thing, small enough to hide in a palm, but it brought a calm predictability to soldiers' pay and merchants' accounts. And that calm was the hidden scaffolding of power. You walk through markets where the ordinary orderliness of life is still discernible. Bales of Egyptian linen sit beside amphorae, stamped with marks of origin and capacity. Grain barges unload into storage buildings that smell faintly of dust and salt. Millers turn the supplies into bread for the city's unknowna. The rationing system that turned imperial promise into daily sustenance. Inspectors check measures and weights because the smallness of daily cheats combines into the largeness of hunger. Hans register bill-loading notes with clerks who scratch at wax tablets. Later, the scribes will copy the notes into registers. rows of neat letters standing guard over the city's balance between the mouths to feed and the cargoes to receive. If you pause by the hippodrome, you might think the city breathes for spectacle, for the roar of chariot races and the factions' banners. But even here, the beating heart is bureaucratic. Tickets, rosters, maintenance schedules, rules for team payments, allocations for feed and care of horses. The show rests on an invisible scaffold of timetables and accounts, and that scaffold, multiplied across the city, is what allows life to proceed. In the countryside, empire meant lists and land. Surveyors carried cords and rods, stepping out plots for tax purposes, marking streams and boundaries, noting yields over seasons. Estates were described in terms of arable strips, orchards, woodland, and pasture, and scribes, bent over manuscripts, made copies that would outlast the owners. The state's appetite was counted in numerals. How many modi of grain in? How many solidi out? For a soldier posted to a frontier fortress, the empire existed in the punctuality of rations and the consistency of his pay. For a village headman, it existed in the cycle of tax collectors and the small flexibilities negotiated against drought or flood. For a bishop, it existed in a slowly unfolding effort to align local practice with imperial doctrine. Most of these lives were simple in their ambitions: delay a payment, secure a better marriage, keep the oxen healthy through winter, arrange for the apprentice to learn a reliable trade. The Eastern Roman world floated on these small hopes and fears, all catalogued, if impersonal, within the empire's clerical mind. Constantius and Theodosius, and later Arcadius and Theodosius II, oversaw not merely imperial succession, but the steady knitting of urban fabric and defensive contour. The Theodosian walls, the massive land defenses that would define the city's silhouette, were not only stone, they were layers of forethought. Engineers calculated angles for towers, distances for arrow ranges, and the slope and thickness of walls to resist rams and fire. The moat, the outer wall, the inner wall, and the frequent towers formed a system that invited maintenance rather than heroics. Teams were assigned to sections. Inspections were scheduled. Records were kept of brick deliveries, lime cargoes, and labor rotations. So the city's security depended on reliable work, repeated over years. You picture the crews scraping mortar, joints in spring sunshine, the foreman checking a list, the supervisor initialing a margin to show the job complete. It is here, in these intervals of quietly correct action, that civilizations persist. Religion, too, became institutional. Councils met to resolve the subtleties of doctrine in terms that would later sound abstract to lay ears, but were quite concrete in their worldly outcomes. A bishop's see mattered to revenue and influence. Monasteries gravitated toward crossroads or agricultural niches, where they could support a steady rhythm of prayer with wine presses or olive groves. Charitable houses developed inventories. Like any estate, the faithful came with bread to be blessed and petitions to be remembered, and the church responded with alms and burial services, hospital beds, and legal intercession. In each chapter house, someone was responsible for provisioning, counting loaves, measuring oil, mending blankets. The scale of the spiritual was recorded in lists, and those lists stabilized what could have become a diffuse movement. One might think of mountains of parchment, but much of the work was done on wax tablets and papyrus, corrected and recopied, till it entered the permanent ink of legal texts and decrees. This is not to say that the empire avoided crisis. It survived by absorbing shocks through routine. When Gothic armies appeared on the borders or crossed rivers after winter ice, the response was not only a matter of cavalry charges, 'twas the issuing of clothing to recruits, the calculation of fodder contracts, the repair of bridge piles, and the bargaining over subsidies that could be paid in gold only if the mint supply of bullion held steady. When earthquakes shook the city, craftsmen were requisitioned, tools tallied, stone moved, and rubble measured. Even in the wake of fires, the work of the state looked like a ledger. Tally damages, assign repair zones, allocate funds, collect. Special levies account for exemptions. The emergencies passed, leaving behind not only rebuilt streets, but marginalia in countless notebooks. Signs that the empire coped by writing and counting as much as by marching and shouting. You pass into the palace district, where the emperor's presence is buffered by corridors of protocol. The order of audiences is regulated. A chamberlain's memo instructs who waits in which antechamber, how many steps the envoy may take, whether gifts are presented before or after the petition. The answer to a provincial complaint may be a few lines on a papyrus that will travel weeks to reach the petitioner, but those lines are copied and stored. The ruler could be imposing or weak, soldierly or bookish, but the institution around him valued consistency. It is here that a critical principle took root. An empire of rules can outlive the men who wear its diadems. That principle guided the legal compilation that would culminate under Justinian. But you can already sense it in the accumulation of edicts and rescripts, in the retention of judicial minutes, in the habit of referring to precedent. Ordinary litigants looking for straightforward resolution of land disputes or inheritance shares cast their hopes into the machinery, relying on clerks who measured their lives in stacks of cases rather than in episodes of glory. The city's economy, ordered by guilds, reads like a directory. There are leather workers assigned to supply the army with harnesses, tailors responsible for tunics of specified quality, bakers regulated in the price and weight of their loaves, and fishmongers subject to inspection for freshness and honesty in scales. A silk industry slowly gathers under imperial supervision, and even when foreign silks dominate, the management of trade routes permissions tolls. Portage absorbs the attention of minor officials whose names do not survive. These men and women are largely invisible in chronicles, but you see them in their workplaces. A woman checking skeins for uniformity, a man counting sacks of grain, a boy sweeping sawdust from a cooper's shop. Their wages and prices change little year to year until disaster pushes them harder or prosperity relaxes them slightly. The urban poor might sleep in insulae with thin walls and small windows, their airflow dependent on the alignment of alleyways and the function of a nearby cistern. The wealthy calculate their rents, plotting investments in warehouses, whose solid returns outshine romance. Consider the circles of education. In neighborhood schools, boys repeat letters and practice copying lines until the shapes become smooth. A handful will advance to rhetoric, where they learn how to arrange an argument, cite examples, and deliver a case. The future administrators and lawyers of Constantinople emerge from this system with shared habits: careful phrasing, attention to definitions, reliance on precedent. The empire's memory is kept not in monuments, but in this trained precision. Of writing, bureaucrats do not idolize novelty. They prefer the known pattern, the established order of sections and subsections, the correct seals and signatures. In these habits, the state finds a kind of quiet immortality. Even defeats can be recorded and absorbed. A lost province becomes a line in a revised map. A fallen fortress becomes an entry in a new defensive plan. A diminished tax base becomes a recalculated assessment. The drive is always toward equilibrium, toward restoring the balance by whatever small daily means can be found. And then, as years turn into decades, you begin to notice that Constantinople's calm is not unchanging. Its markets reflect new trade, its churches reflect evolving theological emphasis, and its bureaucracy digests new categories, sometimes awkwardly. In the 5th century, refugees and resettled groups bring their own patterns of agriculture and craft. The city adjusts by assigning quarters and issuing permits. The walls are extended or reinforced. The water system is patched and expanded. The administration absorbs, listing new names and new places. The little traditions of neighborhoods grow, tying feast days to street processions, linking artisan saints to trades, defining how each quarter will mark weddings and funerals. All of this becomes the tissue of continuity, the way a metropolis makes sense of itself to its inhabitants. To walk through Constantinople is to pass through time shaded by care rather than forced by proclamation. When Justinian arrives on the stage, he does not present himself as a disruptor, but as a restorer, and yet his most lasting interventions are administrative and legal. Before the campaigns of reconquest are imagined, before generals fold maps and calculate river crossings, Justinian and his ministers undertake a different kind of campaigning to bring order to the laws. A century's accumulation of statutes, rescripts, and juristic opinions is chaotic, inconsistent, and difficult for practical use. The solution is not inspiring to the romantic mind, but it is decisive. Commissions are formed, texts are compiled, redundancies eliminated, contradictions reconciled. The corpus codes and digests, institutions and later novellas will not feed a soldier or build a bridge, but it will train minds to think through questions in a stable architecture. In courtrooms, advocates will be able to cite a clear section. Judges will be able to point to an authoritative passage. The laws will become a skeleton, supporting the muscles of policy and the skin of custom. And for ordinary people, the effect will be felt in predictable decisions that carry moral weight. Yet even during Justinian's time, the old rhythm of city life continues. Bakers rise in the dark and measure flour. Candlemakers reach into vats of warm tallow. Dockworkers brace their backs as they shift cargo. A monk copies a leaf of script, leaning close to the parchment to keep his columns straight. And in the hippodrome, the factions still argue about favorites. A ritualized outlet for social tension that sometimes erupts and sometimes subsides without lasting effect. The security of the city depends on thousands of small satisfactions and grievances being absorbed by routines. The hearing of a complaint at a local office, the quiet intervention of a guild elder, the indulgence of a tax extension after a poor harvest. The empire, by design, seeks to prevent sharp edges from cutting deeply. But you can feel, as the 6th century advances, the pressure building, a sense that the vast machinery, while resilient, is going to be tested in ways that numbers and lists alone cannot entirely cushion. In this moment, before the storms, you stand again by the walls and trace the horizon, imagining ships approaching from distant provinces, bringing wool and wine, oil and ideas. You picture the Senate House, where not only orations, but also budgets and priorities are weighed. You watch an overseer check a team of masons repairing a breach after a winter frost. The calm, methodical attention to maintenance has held the city together for generations. And yet, once you breathe in and out, you begin to ask what will happen when calamities converge, when a riot consumes the city's center, when an earthquake shakes more than plaster loose, when a sickness travels with trade, unseen and unweighed, to expose the fragility of routines. Will the ledgers still balance when the numbers become grim? Will the courts keep calm when petitioners multiply? Will the aqueducts suffice when labor disappears? The empire has prepared for contingencies in its careful way, but is there a ledger for chaos? A list long enough to count what is coming next? You stand again beneath the clean geometry of the Theodosian walls as winter clouds roll in from the Thracian plain. And you feel how much of this story depends on routine. Dusty carts of lime pull up against a storehouse wall. Foremen argue in low voices about the sequence of repairs. Lanterns are checked to ensure enough oil for the night watch. Then, all at once, routine is dragged into the noise of disorder. The hippodrome, that measuring house of public emotion, becomes a furnace. The factions, those organized blocks of loyalty in blue and green, murmur grievance into chant, and chant into violence. At first, it is a matter of arrests mishandled and punishments resented. Then, because an empire is woven from many threads, it becomes something larger, a combustion of tax complaints, resentment of officials, weariness with corruption, and the frictions of a city always on the edge of plenty, and anxiety. Bricks meant for renovations are pried up to become projectiles. Shops close shutters. An order for the closing of the city gates is written in a neat, practiced hand, carried by a runner who knows every stair and corridor of the palace district. The riot does not feel like a grand event to the people in it. It feels like heat and smoke and the difficulty of getting water to a fire. It is the problem of organizing bucket lines down narrow streets where a dropped pail can break a rhythm. The problem of counting where crowds have no patience for being counted. Curfews are announced, but those are just words until men with staffs take their routes and record their rounds. The palace staff consults distribution lists for the guard, reinforcement points, gatehouse assignments, messenger schedules between commanders. The emperor considers the narrow calculus of concessions and force. A city that relies on predictable deliveries of grain and fuel finds those deliveries disrupted, and once household stores are touched, anxiety grows. The power of the empire has to be expressed in a practical grammar of small actions, assembling cohorts at choke points, securing the warehouses that matter, ensuring that the aqueduct flow isn't compromised by sabotage. Even decisive moments when troops push into the hippodrome and the shouting collapses into surrender are followed by prosaic tasks, counting casualties, listing damage to public buildings, drafting orders for repairs, identifying which workshops can resume work the fastest. In the wake of the fire, the city does what it was built to do. It rebuilds. You watch a clerk in a small office near the Augustaian compile inventories of materials on hand, timber batches by length, marble stock by color and origin, brick lots by stamp and killing date. The rebuilding of the city's great church, which will become a symbol beyond the empire's lifespan, is at first a problem of supply chains and labor choreography. Stones must be quarried and lifted. Brick kilns must be fired with enough fuel at the right times. Oxen must be fed to pull cartloads of mortar and sand. Architects draft plans with measurements that carpenters can mark in chalk on scaffolding. Decisions about column height and span must be translated into estimates of rope and pulley capacity. Shipments from quarries and workshops hundreds of miles away are coordinated with the patience of postal schedules. And when storms delay arrivals, site work must be rescheduled to avoid idle teams. The dream of dome and light is supported by ledgers that account for wages, fill the consumption of nails and clamps, for the daily rationing of bread and dried fish. 2,000s of hands. The organization of labor is as complex as the stonework. Teams are structured so that specialists, masons, plasterers, glass fitters move in sequence, each avoiding tripping over the other's tasks. A workday is divided by the rhythm of bells. Foremen initial line items for hours worked and payroll. Scribes compare those initials to a list of names secure in a chest. The men who climb scaffolds and the men who carry water speak different languages of honor and responsibility. But the project binds them by a calculus of shared tools and mutual reliance. When a scaffold post cracks, a carpenter replaces it. Before evening, when a mortar batch sets too quickly, an apprentice is sent to fetch water from a cistern that must itself be monitored for level and replenishment. The miracle that visitors will later perceive in the building's vaults is the end of a long chain of small adjustments and predictable routines. In a corner office, someone notes that a certain kill's output was flawed and adds a mark to a vendor's name, and this mark means fewer orders in the next cycle. This is how excellence is maintained, not by dramatic decree, but by the slow discipline of record and response. The same city that organizes its repairs so efficiently cannot calculate everything. Ships bring more than timber and marble on a Day with nothing special in it. A sickness enters the city, uncounted and unnamed by the first households it touches. The rhythms of life mask its arrival. A porter continues his rounds for a day or two beyond prudence. A cook prepares the same porridge, then cannot finish it. A clerk coughs in a scriptorium and thinks of dust, when the sickness no longer hides. The registers begin to fill with a different kind of number. Absences, work teams shrink, breadlines lengthen and then shorten as people fail to show. The city's administrators do what they know. They make lists of symptoms, of affected districts, of medical supplies. They requisition carts for moving the afflicted, then for moving bodies. Priests adjust schedules to accommodate hurried rites. The steady pipelines of food and water must continue, and so special teams are organized to maintain them, kept as separate as possible from the sick, with daily checks for fever. The assumption, always, is that a system can be stabilized by good order. It is the only language the administration speaks. Daily life absorbs the shock as it can. Bakers work until they cannot. The watch passes lamps hand to hand through thinner patrols. The man with a garden behind his shop shares greens with a neighbor whose supplier has stopped arriving. Payments are postponed, then postponed again. The city knows how to extend deadlines. Mechanisms for tax relief exist, even if they were designed for crop failure rather than epidemic. Officials write exemptions into margins. Wills are drawn up in cramped, careful hands. Notaries, who live by the predictability of words, find themselves asked to attend to households where predictability has vanished. The city's sound changes. Fewer hawkers' cries, more carts in the quiet of morning. A chorus of distant hammers keeping up the necessary tasks while much else pauses. The empire's greatest strength, its habit of ordered response, becomes a question. What do you count when everything is uncountable? Beyond the capital, campaigns proceed because they have been scheduled. The empire still imagines itself able to recalibrate the western edge of the Mediterranean, and generals move toward targets with trains of siege engines and kitchens fodder. Animals and carpenters, accountants and priests. A fleet is not only ships, 'tis dock space monitored in hours. Barrels marked for contents and destination, ropes and sails logged for wear. Even strategy requires provisioning tables, water sources noted along a march route, distances between granaries and depots, backup plans for replenishing in hostile territory. War in this vision is logistics with decisions at the edges. When news of sickness from the capital reaches field commanders, it becomes a column and a ledger. Expected reinforcements are delayed. Supply shipments must be rerouted. Fallback positions must be stocked for longer. The letters that carry this information are written in the same neat script as orders for stone deliveries. The empire's handwriting persists even when its voice trembles. Inside the city, the question is how to keep the indispensable parts of life functioning. The aqueduct must flow, so teams are rotated to minimize exposure. And testing points are checked with extra care for leaks and contamination. Mills must turn, so grain allocations are recalculated based on a sparser workforce, and grinding is prioritized for the districts with the least capacity to cope. Markets are reorganized to reduce congestion, wider intervals between stalls and officers posted to enforce the new arrangement. The same stubborn practicality that built the walls now builds routines for crisis. An hour at dawn for deliveries to infirmaries. Mid-morning for household purchasing by district. Afternoon for restocking. The rhythm of the service in churches shifts to accommodate the city's need for consolation at odd hours. And the stewards in those churches keep lists of candles and oil and bread with a care that makes devotion tangible. The plague does not care that the city is well administered. It moves with the indifference of wind, notices that certain kinds of work require proximity, and pushes through those cracks. Men who have exchanged tools for years without thinking now avoid the touch of familiar handles. Laundry goes unwashed longer than it should. Stale air sits in rooms longer than is healthy. The hardest detail to manage is exhaustion. The good order of the city depends on people showing up to record, to stamp, to carry, to cook. The absence of one clerk can delay a dozen payments, and the delay of those payments can thin the workforce. And the thinning of the workforce can leave a granary unguarded, and an unguarded granary can become a point of panic. Yet for all that, the machine does not stop entirely. It slows, grinds, jumps, continues. A young apprentice learns to stamp receipts because the older man is gone. A baker's daughter learns a schedule of kneading and timing because there is no one else to do it. In this way, ordinary competence becomes a kind of heroism no one will sing about. When ships do arrive at the harbors, their cargoes are examined with more attention than before. Spices and cloth seem foreign in the face of more immediate needs. Grain, oil, timber for coffins. A post is created temporarily. It is said for overseeing funerary provisioning. And in the city's book of offices, a line is added that will be forgotten in calmer years. Garden plots within the walls are measured again for potential food production. The empire has an instinct for self-sufficiency within secure perimeters. Even the palace kitchen reduces its orders, and once regular shipments of delicacies are turned into more bread and more soup. Lists of orphans are kept and matched to households that can take them in. This, too, is administration. Less romantic but more humane than many imperial acts. A city that counts in order to tax fines, it can count in order to care when the sickness recedes. The city looks older for the first time. Replacement is slower than loss. But the very habits that seemed rigid prove flexible enough to help recovery. Deferred taxes are scheduled in small increments over years, avoiding the shock that would break fragile balance. Craftsmen who lost their shops are given access to shared spaces under supervised loans of tools. Repayments are tracked in margins, and the margins show that, slowly, work returns. The building that was meant to proclaim stability now does so. In a new way, its dome floats above a population that knows deeply the value of routine, and its walls hold a reverberation of prayers for ordinary days. The empire discovers in this interval that continuity is not the absence of change, but that capacity to absorb it, to distribute shocks across many shoulders, to write flexible rules without abandoning the old form. You consider again the campaigns abroad, the maps that were earlier decorated with arrows and colored borders. The cost of those arrows is written in the city's narrow alleys. Even success in distant theaters returns home as bills to be paid, roofs to be repaired, men to be replaced. The balances between prestige and endurance are not symmetrical. Victories brighten the chronicles. Maintenance prevents the chronicle from ending. You can almost see a scribe pausing, pen lifted, deciding how to record this balance honestly. A line for triumph, a paragraph for provisioning, a sigh left unwritten for the weariness of the city's people. There is a temptation in such times to think that a grand effort will reset the world. But for this city, the grand effort always turns out to be 1,000 small ones. Repeated and refined, you end this day on a quay, listening to the wash of water against pilings. The harbor master closes his ledger with a thud, satisfied that the allocations for the morning's unloading are clear. A watchman checks a gate, rattling the iron to hear that it holds. A woman locks her shop and whispers to herself the list of what to buy when the market opens. The empire's greatness, in this moment, is a quiet coordination of intentions, to show up, to keep measure, to carry through. Yet you can feel the strain. The city has survived riot, rebuilt in stone and glass, endured a sickness that made counting a kind of grief. It has kept the water moving and the bread rising, and it has continued to send orders out to the edges of its imagined world. The question that remains is whether the routines that save the city can also draw the lines for a new stability, or whether the costs of renewal and reconquest, the lingering gaps in the ranks of the living, and the press of peoples beyond. The old frontiers will force a more permanent recalibration. When order itself must change to remain order, how do you write the new columns in a book that has defined the old ones for so long? You return to the palace archives, where the smell of ink and parchment is strongest at dawn, and where the city keeps its self-understanding in neat lines of script. In these rooms, after riot and plague, the desire for clarity becomes almost a moral imperative. The legal compilations that began as an act of tiding, bringing scattered judgments and pronouncements into a coherent body, now function as a stabilizing armature for an empire that has seen how quickly contingencies can erase custom. You watch a young advocate trace a finger down a column, locate the passage that applies to a dispute over inheritance after a year of exceptional deaths, and construct an argument that is less about victory than about fairness. Everyone in the room can recognize the judge, too, is protecting more than a client. He is defending the idea that rules survive disaster. The city's officials know this viscerally. A rule that holds becomes a kind of shelter. When you can say, with authority, how a contract will be interpreted or a debt rescheduled because the text says so, people can plan again. The habit of referring to written norms becomes a social bomb. The code is not a monument you can visit. Yet you feel its architecture in the way acts are framed, in the way duties are enumerated. Sections define offices and obligations, clarify property rights, and fix penalties for malfeasance. You can see how the code interacts with the daily work of the city's guilds and tribunals. A baker accused of short loaves has a path to defend himself. An artisan whose workshop was requisitioned for repairs can present a claim for compensation. A tax collector accused of overreach can be disciplined according to a known procedure. This web of words, because it is accessible to those who can read and predictable for those who cannot, creates a return to ordinary courage. People are willing to bring grievances forward because the process is not a cliff but a staircase. The empire, which has always been a community of documents, becomes even more so, and that is not a sterile thing. It is the means by which lives regain contour beyond the law. The city directs its attention to frontiers that have shifted and to neighbors whose patterns have changed. River crossings that once saw seasonal traders now see families with carts and herds. Watchtowers along the Danube and in Anatolian passes are inspected not for their heroics but for their roofs. If they leak, a guard will sleep badly. If they sleep badly, they will miss the light of a signal. Supplies are apportioned carefully, with rations calculated for new mixes of troops, increasingly made up of men settled from beyond old borders, integrated through oaths, land allotments, and regular pay. The empire's strength is not purity, but the patient capacity to make new arrangements durable. A village is moved from a floodplain to a hill. A frontier fort is adjusted to use more stone and less timber. A tax district is remeasured after migration. Each adjustment is recorded by men who consider the right slope for a wall or the right assessment for a household with an extra child. The scale is humble, but the effects are cumulative. In the city's neighborhoods, life acquires a slower, steadier beat. Bakeries that survived reopen with pared-down staffs. Apprentices become masters earlier than they expected, learning to purchase flour on terms that won't bankrupt them. A leather worker changes suppliers because the old one never returned, and new relationships are forged over cups of watered wine, measured by samples cut from hides and tugged to test their resilience. Women who have often kept households balanced through uncertainty take on more visible roles in shops and workshops. The notices posted by the eparch, the city's chief administrator, dress these realities in calm, almost bland language. Market hours, price ceilings on staples, inspection schedules for scales and measures, reminders about key access. There is a dignity in dullness. The city is not trying to impress anyone, only to keep itself whole. If you walk through the rebuilt Great Church in the early morning, when workers pause before the day's tasks, you see what the city has made of itself. Light pools under the dome and slides along stone that has traveled farther than most people ever will. Mosaics glitter with scenes that residents might interpret as comfort or admonition. The building represents a story about stability after upheaval, but not as a triumphal shout. Rather, as a promise that under these curves and surfaces, there is coherence. Even those who are not religious in a strict sense might feel gratitude. For any roof that does not leak, any beam that does not wobble, any organization that, when written to, answers. That is the way an empire justifies itself after years of strain, by being there. The military commitments across the seas and along the frontiers continue. But you can read in the provisioning lists that the empire is learning restraint. Ships are loaded with an awareness that replacements will be harder to find. Commanders are instructed in the dull art of avoidance as much as in pursuit. There is wisdom in making enemies wait, in letting disease and shortage erode a siege, in paying a subsidy that is cheaper than a campaign. These are not glorious choices, and they will not strain a sculptor's arm with commissions. But they keep columns straight in the books and roofs repaired at home. The city remains a place of markets and mills because it avoids adventures that would turn it into a place of ruins again. The relief felt when the year's grain arrives on schedule is a better measure of well-being than any victory procession in households. The talk is practical. A father asks his son whether it is time to learn a clerk's hand or to take up a trade. Either path supports the city, and both are honorable. A mother calculates whether to bring a cousin in from the countryside to help with children and shop. People pray for rain and for steady prices. The rhythm of festivals resumes, with processions that, after years of interruption, feel like threads picked up again. The small economies of neighborhood charity bread left for someone at a doorway. A roof repaired by extra hands. A loan forgiven without announcement do as much to knit the city as any law. The empire's enormous machinery hums alongside. These smaller engines, and together, they produce the heat that keeps winter tolerable and summer orderly. You sense that the city understands itself more deeply now. It no longer confuses noise with strength. It knows, in the way old craftsmen know the grain of wood, that its endurance comes from the correctness of repeated acts. A lock checked, a measure verified, an account balanced, a candle snuffed before. Sleep. The sensation of catastrophic vulnerability is not gone. It has been integrated. People know how quickly things can fail, and they know what must not fail again. They fuss over cisterns more than before. They lay in a little extra grain. They keep a second set of tools. The city's officials, for their part, trim ambitions to what the administration can actually sustain. They revise schedules instead of issuing proclamations about greatness. The empire's rhetoric softens into something that better fits its true values: fairness, reliability, patience. A visitor from another century might think this dull, but you, living among these people, know that dullness is a matter of perspective. The same steadiness that lulls the outsider to sleep is, for the insider, a source of relief. It is possible to plan weddings and apprenticeships again, to make lists that do not feel like illusions. The often unnamed men and women who carry out inspections, copy ledgers, and keep warehouses in order become the quiet heroes of your city. When they do their jobs well, they create space for other lives to proceed without drama. In that sense, the law books and the watch schedules and the brick tallies are not mere bureaucratic debris. They are the tools by which people live without fear most days, at the end of this arc from refoundation through riot and rebuilding. And sickness to recovery, what remains most impressive is the city's refusal to define itself by singular events. It is formed by climate as much as by decree, by the slow circling of seasons and the persistence of sea trade, by the endless mending of surfaces. It has learned to accept that no wall is finished, only maintained. No code is final, only revised. No population is permanent, only hosted. This acceptance is not resignation. It is the art of survival. The capital will face pressures yet, migrations in waves, competitors at sea, tremors of belief and argument, the decay of distant strongholds and the rise of others. The city's answer will again be a ledger, a matter of what can be afforded, in money and in lives, to keep the water running and the lights burning. When you close your eyes to rest in this place, you may wonder, in that drowsy way that leaves questions hanging in the air, whether all greatness is really this, the serene mastery of maintenance, and if it is, will those who inherit the archives. After you remember that maintenance requires its own kind of imagination, and keep practicing it when easier stories of boldness beckon. You begin, as so many administrators once did, with a simple object, a wax tablet. Its surface buffed and clean, tucked inside a wooden frame with a cord to tie it shut. In this tablet, a clerk will press a stylus to carve narrow letters that are less about eloquence than about order. He will write names of villages, numbers of hearths, yields of barley and wheat, the tally of sheep, the width of a mill race, and the schedule for the next inspection day. It is not thrilling. It is a list, and like most lists, it is humble and hungry at once, wanting more entries, more precision, more confirmation. The empire depends on this appetite to count, because counting transforms the messy abundance of life into obligations that can be planned. Taxes to be remitted, soldiers to be fed, roads to be repaired, city markets to be supplied. If you want to understand how Byzantium worked, you must stand beside the men and women who did the counting, and then follow their lists to see how they turned into loaves, bolts of cloth, coins, and quiet nights. The basic unit of government in the countryside is not a heroic fortress or a singular manor, but an administrative circuit. A tax assessor travels this route with a pack horse and 2 assistants, measuring fields with cords, cross-checking an earlier register against a new report, taking notes on a farm that has been divided among sons, marking the death of a widow, whose exemption should lapse, and noting a mill wheel that needs repair. He refers to a cadastral record called a practicon when it has been formalized, and in it the land holdings of a district are arranged like the pieces of a board game. Parcels shaded by orchards, strips of arable pasture by the stream, vines on a slope. Each piece is attached to a household, and each household is attached to obligations. The questions are free of romance. How many modi of wheat could this land reasonably yield this year? How much of that yield is needed to feed the household? What remainder can be taxed? Is the mill functional? Did the roof on the storage shed collapse last winter? And will the bridge be passable when carts bring grain to the river landing? The assessor writes what he can verify and carries forward what must be checked by another office. You can hear the small negotiations in his wake. A farmer asking for a reduction because hail stripped the vines. A village headman promising to fix the bridge if the deadline for grain delivery is pushed by a week. A widow asking that her son's military service count toward their tax arrears. Taxes are not a single thing. They come in forms that reflect the empire's changing needs and habits. There is land tax calculated on the productive capacity of fields and orchards. There is a hearth tax, which counts households by the smoke that rises from their roofs. There are customs duties on the movement of goods through toll stations and ports. There are special levies for emergency repairs, and there are fees embedded in services such as the use of public mills or ferries. When you read the registers, you see how much of the state's intelligence lies in classification. Land is categorized by quality good, middling, poor with adjustments for irrigation and slope. Animals are classified by usefulness to agricultural cycles. Labor obligations are tabulated against seasons of planting and harvest to avoid paralyzing the very production. That will be taxed. The purpose is not cruelty, though it can feel like it to those who must pay. The purpose is predictability. If a village knows that its assessment will be recalculated every few years according to known criteria, then it can plant the lower field in barley to hedge against a poor wheat harvest, repair the weir to keep the mill turning, set aside a portion of olive oil for market sale at the coastal town, and save the coin for customs dues. The headman's ledger mirrors the state's ledger, a small version of the same desire for balance. Coins, so small in the hand, help the empire keep its shape. The gold piece that soldiers carry in pay pouches and that merchants weigh with careful attention is more than precious metal. It is trust. Its purity is protected by ritual and penalty. Its weight is standardized and checked at markets. Its image is a promise that exchanges made today will be recognized tomorrow. Around the gold circulate other coins in silver and copper, the everyday instruments of buying and selling fish, bread, cloth, and tools. Over time, these mix of coins will alter in weight and fineness, because the empire itself changes with war and peace, expansion and contraction. When a currency is strong, you see it in the calm with which scales are set on counters and purses are opened. When it weakens, you see it in the frowns of shopkeepers and the cleverness of money changers. For now, imagine the coin as steady. Imagine a baker paying a flour merchant and receiving change, then paying an apprentice his weekly wage, then placing a handful of coins beneath a tile in the floor, where the family has a habit of saving a little against misfortune. The circulation of coin is a physical map of relationships. Each exchange is a line. The city is a dense weave. The countryside is a looser net tied to market days and seasonal fairs. The empire's fiscal offices are arranged like organs in a body. Each has a function. Some inhale reports, others exhale orders, others pump resources to where they are needed. Messages move by road posts, where riders change horses and clerks stamp receipts. At the center, in the capital, a cluster of offices coordinates all this motion, the Finance Bureau checking remittances against assessments, the Provisioning Office ensuring that garrisons in frontier districts receive flour, wine, oil, and meat on the scheduled dates, the armories recording the redemption of worn-out equipment and the issue of new spears, shields, and bowstrings, the Customs Office scheduling inspections at harbors where ships arrive with cargoes of grain, cloth, timber, and iron. The language of administration is dense with titles and the memory of older offices. But underneath the names, the work is straightforward: intake, calculation, allocation, dispatch, audit. The empire does not rely on genius. It relies on a bench of modest competence. A clerk who understands the difference between a deficiency caused by drought and one caused by negligence is worth more than a dozen orators in cities and larger towns. The habits of counting extend to guilds. The trades that make life possible: bakers, butchers, fishmongers, tanners, leatherworkers, weavers, metalworkers. Shipwrights organize themselves with rules for apprenticeship, standards of quality, and obligations to supply the market at regulated prices in times of shortage. You can picture the guild hall of the bakers: a long table, a ledger, a set of standardized weights, a sample loaf kept as a model. Inspections are dull but essential. A guild elder slices a loaf and checks its weight. Another inspects flour for adulteration. A third posts a notice reminding members that prices are capped for the next 30 days, because river traffic is delayed by storms. When a bakery's oven fails, the guild arranges emergency baking at a neighbor's shop to ensure that the morning's bread still appears on stalls. The underlying idea is simple. Monopoly power is tolerated in exchange for the public good of stable supply and quality. In this bargain, paperwork is the guarantor. There are names, dates, signatures, and seals. There are fines for defects, and there are procedures for contesting those fines. Even in disputes, the result is an entry in a book. Daily life in the capital is measured by these arrangements. At dawn, you can follow a street vendor pushing a cart of cups of watered wine and small breads. Weaving through lanes where artisans lift shutters and sweep thresholds. A fishmonger rinses his stall and waits for the first baskets to arrive from the wharf. A tanner's apprentice labors over hides in a courtyard that smells of bark and oils. A scribe in a front room begins the day with copying a letter for a shopkeeper who must send a polite complaint to a supplier about short measure. Children carry pitchers to cisterns. Water carriers shout their routes. A woman steams her loom's warp threads to keep them supple. The market opens with a hum that is not yet loud. When you stop to listen, you hear prices compared, weights checked, a thin scale recalibrated with a finger's flick. Over it all rests a shared expectation that the rules for weight and price, for hours and delivery, are not merely suggestions. These rules have been posted. The city's chief magistrate will enforce them. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. Which for practical purposes is enough. A food riot is most easily prevented by good lists and honest scales. Behind this public face, there is a constant conversation between center and localities. The capital issues directives. Provinces answer with figures. And between them are intermediaries, regional governors, city administrators, village headmen, and monastery stewards who translate orders into practical arrangements. Consider the question of road maintenance. It is tempting to think of roads as either finished or ruined, but in reality, they live by increments. A section paved with new stones this season, a bridge resurfaced next, a ditch cleared after spring rains, a culvert rebuilt before winter. Local officials assign labor in rotational crews immune from other obligations while on road duty. Exemptions are recorded. The schedule is posted near the market and read aloud. When you walk a mile of road and find it passable after a storm, you are walking on hundreds of small notices and permissions on names crossed off lists. The empire rests upon this persistent, uninteresting correctness. Every system has pressure points. One is the frontier where customs dues are collected and smuggling tempts the impatient. At rivers and mountain passes, the empire posts officers who inspect carts and animals, take affidavits on cargo contents, reconcile declarations with spot checks, and collect fees according to schedules that vary with commodity and season. The officers work from tables of rates so that olive oil pays one amount, dyed cloth another, and iron yet another. Merchants grumble, as merchants always do, but grumbling is accounted for in the business of movement. The real risk is uncertainty. A sudden change in rates without notice, or a corrupt inspector inventing a fee, can upset the delicate balances in market towns downstream. The empire fights this risk by publishing standard rates and allowing appeals, and by rotating officers, so that cozy arrangements do not calcify. When an appeal is made, it travels up the line as a letter with attachments. The reply weeks later might simply be a confirmation that the posted rate stands and that the inspector is cautioned. The drama here is in the prevention of drama. Monasteries, often imagined only in terms of prayer and contemplation, live within this world of counting. Their stewards keep ledgers as carefully as any merchant. Plots of land under their management, yields by season, rents due from tenants, alms distributed, candles consumed in worship, loaves baked for the poor, medicines prepared for the infirmary, beds made up in the guest house. The abbot signs off on balances. A brother trained in numbers prepares reports. That can be shown to officials if questions arise about tax liabilities or exemptions. The monastery's calendar is full of harvest dates and feast days, planting schedules and fasts, and the integration of agricultural work with liturgical rhythm generates a stability that radiates to surrounding communities. In a famine year, a monastery may open its granary. In a prosperous year, it may repair a neighbor's roof. Its ability to do so depends on the same prosaic care: avoiding waste, storing correctly, rotating stock, pruning vineyards at the right time, and keeping tools in repair. Even sanctity has a ledger. The household, too, is a small treasury of order. In a corner of the main room, there is a chest where documents are kept, a marriage contract specifying dowry items, down to the number of sheets and the quality of cups, a receipt for the purchase of a donkey, a lease for a small plot of land by the river, a letter from a cousin promising delivery of 3 jars of oil after the harvest, a note from a local official reminding the household of a work obligation. On the city walls next month, a husband and wife seated in the evening light review these papers and decide what to do: sell a small quantity of wool to pay the tax due, or postpone a purchase until after the market next week. Take their daughter to the scribe to learn her letters so that she can help with shop accounts. Ask the neighbor to share the cost of repairing the well cover because both families use it. In their decisions, you glimpse the larger theme. The empire functions when households have enough predictability to plan. And the administration's job is to create that predictability by being boringly reliable. Yet the system is not free of tension. Large landowners, powerful by wealth and connections, can distort the balance by shielding themselves from obligations and shifting burdens onto smaller neighbors. Officials at the center are aware of this danger, and from time to time edicts are issued to protect smallholders from dispossession. To prevent the accumulation of too much land by powerful houses and to ensure that tax liabilities are not so easily evaded that the state must squeeze the weak to compensate. The success of these edicts is mixed, as success always is in a society where influence is real. Still, the attempt matters. It sets a norm that officials in the field can invoke to resist pressure. When a small farmer comes to complain that a great estate has absorbed his strip of land by dubious means, there is at least a rule to cite, a procedure to invoke, a letter to write. The existence of a channel for redress, even if clogged at times, is itself a form of protection. If you follow the path of a single coin from a market stall in the capital to a frontier garrison, you can see how integration works. The coin changes hands in payment for bread. The baker uses it to buy flour. The flour merchant uses it to pay a customs duty on a shipment just arrived. The customs officer remits it to the provincial treasury. The provincial treasury includes it in a shipment of pay for soldiers. A soldier spends it in a village for a new pair of sandals. The sandal maker uses it to buy leather. The leather seller brings it back to the city to pay a tax due at the end of the month. The coin is not a character. It has no mind, but it tells you the story of connective tissue. If that tissue is intact, the empire breathes easily. If a disease strikes the city and interrupts work, if raiders cut the road and stall the transport, if a corrupt official intercepts payments, if a powerful man seizes the sandals without paying, then the coin's journey is broken. And with it, the quiet confidence of people who need the predictability of small outcomes. Every so often, you find a moment where the entire system must demonstrate its elasticity. A poor harvest in 2 districts means less grain arriving at the city. The response is not to panic, but to adjust. Import more fish. Pressure merchants to bring in grain from farther out by guaranteeing favorable prices. Release a portion from public granaries. Ease price caps slightly to keep bakers solvent. Encourage monasteries to supplement. The city announces new market hours to spread crowds. Officials add more inspectors at scales. The guild posts reminders to its members on quality. The effect is less an impression of command than one of competence. The difference matters. Command assumes obedience and collapses when it is not granted. Competence builds cooperation and adjusts to reality as it changes. The empire's genius, to the extent it has one, lies in its patience with the ordinary. You might be tempted to call all this dull, but the dullness is precisely what allows you to sleep at night. It is the reason your lamp oil will be cheaper in autumn than in spring, the reason water will continue to flow, the reason a dispute over a boundary stone can be resolved by reference to a record instead of by a knife in the dark. The people who make this possible are not glamorous. They are the clerk who notices a discrepancy in a number and asks a question, the steward who prepares a fair distribution of a monastery surplus, the guild elder who walks the market and reminds a member to mind the posted price, the village headman who insists that road crews really report on the day appointed. They speak softly, they write more than they talk, and they have a stubborn affection for things being the way they are supposed to be. When you look at the empire as an organism made of lists, ledgers, and schedules, you start to see the subtlety of survival. It is not merely the ability to win battles or build splendid churches. It is the willingness to align countless small actions toward a general stability, to make fairness habitual, to regard promises as binding even when inconvenient. And yet, waters rise and fall, neighbors change, currencies shift, and people are people. The empire will face shocks of war, theology, commerce, and weather. In some years, it will respond with grace. In others, it will stumble. But in the long stretches where nothing dramatic happens, the work you have followed here will carry the weight of continuity. As you leave the counting house and walk into the street, the light is low and the air smells of bread and damp stone. Somewhere an inspector is writing his last entry of the day, and somewhere else a household is opening a chest to add or remove a coin. A small sound that echoes the entire order. You wonder, in this easing twilight, whether the sameness you have seen is strong enough to bend without breaking when the next great change arrives. And if it is not, who among all these careful people will first notice that the numbers no longer add up? You wake to a city that measures itself in bells and bread, where daylight is divided into tasks so ordinary they almost disappear into habit. If you live here, you learn the schedule without thinking. Before dawn, water carriers are already on the stairs of cisterns, dipping buckets into a cold, echoing darkness and hauling the weight up ladder rungs that glisten with moisture. The cisterns belong to the whole, not to any one house, and their levels are not a secret. A steward from the district notes the depth on a marked pole, records the number on a tablet, and compares it to last week's reading. The aqueduct's flow is a public question. When repairs are needed, notices are posted at the corners of streets to warn which hours will be dry, and you plan around those hours the way you plan a bake or a wash. The water gets into everything, into mills that grind flour, into baths that keep the crush of the city tolerable, into the kitchens where fish stew simmers beside flat loaves browning in a shallow oven. The city's greatness is not the marble you see, but the water you do not see, passing under streets and behind walls, managed by a bureaucracy that prefers to talk about valves and silt rather than glory. You walk out under the soft haze of morning and meet a world organized by the eparch's decrees, which you do not need to read to feel. It is there in the shape of the market. Stalls open in order, fish at one end, greens and herbs next. Then, the heavy burdens of grain and flour, the neatly stacked loaves, the baskets of dates and olives. And, farther on, the leather goods, the simple metalwork, the skeins of wool dyed in careful lots. Inspectors with thin rods and steady hands check scales and weights as they move. They touch the standard pound to a vendor's counterweight and adjust it with a sliver of lead if necessary. When they fine a seller, the penalty is not an insult, but a routine correction recorded in a ledger along with the seller's acknowledgement. You can buy at a fair price because a dull system of measuring has a kind of moral force in this city. The guilds make it visible. Each trade keeps its own book of standards, and if you apprentice, You'll learn to think of your work in numbers first. So many turns of a spindle, so many hours in a dye bath, so many degrees of heat for so many minutes. Craft here is a sequence as much as a skill. Behind the market's hum stands a quieter hum of offices. The city's watch a force of men who know alleys as well as main roads distributes, itself according to a plan that reads like a timetable, rather than a story of daring-do. Patrols change at set hours. Reports are made at set points, signed by the senior man on duty. At night, lantern routes are assigned so that no stretch of darkness goes unvisited too long. Fire is a danger in a city of wood and cloth, so the watch checks for banked coals left carelessly, and it enforces rules about hearths and braziers after curfew. If a fire breaks out, the alarm is a pattern of bells and shouts repeated from one corner to the next, and a predetermined set of bucket brigades and tool teams converges from workshops where the crews have been idling, waiting for just such. And order, even chaos when it comes, is treated as a logistics problem. Streets must be kept clear for the flow of water. Doors must be forced in a sequence to ventilate smoke, and the cordon must be placed to keep onlookers outside the zone where roof beams might fall. That is how the city understands itself, as a thing to be kept in working order. If you slip away from the market into a side street, you find the lived geometry of urban life. Houses lean toward each other, their upper stories nearly touching across narrow lanes. Windows act as communication. Woman leans out to pass a basket to a neighbor. A boy returns it with bread slices hot from the oven. Courtyards are busy with small domestic economies, a loom humming under the quick movements of a weaver's hands. Jars of fermenting cabbage in the shade. A rack of fish drying in salt-scented air. Each household keeps a mental ledger of obligations and favors. Each keeps a small supply of essential goods against the day the market is disrupted. When an official's runner posts a notice that the aqueduct will be closed for repairs from noon to mid-afternoon 2 days hence, there is no panic. People fill what they need the evening before, adjust laundry days, shift the timing of a batch of cheese. You feel the slow talent the city has for adjustment, not because it is remarkably flexible, but because it is habitually informed. You come upon a hospital whose life is a mixture of prayer, instruction, and procedures that would not be out of place in a barracks. Beds are lined in a hall, and each bed has a number. A steward's list matches names to numbers, conditions to treatments, and treatments to supplies. The rhythm of care moves by the clock as monks and lay attendants measure doses and change bandages. A kitchen attached to the hospital prepares broths and bread so that the sick have food that can be counted on. Cleanliness, as much as anyone here understands it, is enforced by rules. Washing of hands at basins before and after touching the sick, laundering of linens according to a schedule, fumigation of rooms with smoldering herbs between waves of patients. The hospital is not only a pious institution, it is a logistic center for suffering. Its dignity lies in the fact that it will likely be there tomorrow and next week in much the same form. An anchor of predictability in a disease-prone world. Religion. Elsewhere in the city is likewise organized by schedule. The great churches and the small parish chapels run on timetables that shape the week vigils. Matins, vespers, the long sequence of psalms, readings, and hymns. If you go, you know when to arrive and when to leave. The clergy's work shows. In lists, names of the poor to be visited, supplies of oil and candles to be replenished, vestments to be cleaned, bread to be baked for the Eucharist. Confraternities adopt specific duties, and you see them on their appointed rounds, moving in small groups with serious faces. When a festival comes, the processions are choreographed so that the city's traffic may continue. Routes are marked. The watch rearranges itself to prevent bottlenecks. The relationship between devotion and administration is not accidental. Piety is given shape by logistics, and logistics are given purpose by piety, And for an ordinary person, the benefit is that both the soul's needs and the body's needs are met without spectacle. You find the docks, and with them, the empire's patience with tides and winds. Harbor masters keep lists that tell them which ships are due and where to place them. Warehouses are assigned by commodity. Grain has its own sheds, and so does timber. So do amphorae of oil and wine. So do bales of cloth. Forks of lanes lead to counting points where teams record the arrival and departure of goods. And these records travel to offices where taxes are assessed and quarrels are resolved. Sailing schedules are not fixed. They ride on weather and on the state of the sea, but the bureaucracy's response to that fluidity is not to despair. It is to calculate 4 ranges. A convoy expected in the second half of the month might arrive. Early space is held, in case it does. If it arrives late, notices go out to bakers about the anticipated effect on flour prices. As you watch, a line of men carry sacks from a ship's deck up a gangplank into a waiting storehouse. And the movement does not stop until a clerk nods to indicate the count is complete. There is little romance here, only the reliable energy of people whose work is measured in units moved. In the eparch's building, a different dock exists, one made of desks and shelves. Notaries sit on benches, their tools assembled with quiet pride, pens trimmed and tested, paper and parchment stacked by size, seals kept in little boxes, ink prepared with a recipe they know by heart. People come to them with affairs that look small but add up to the city's continued existence. There is a rental agreement for a workshop that comes with the use of a shared oven, a loan secured on a basket of silver cups, a marriage contract that names the daughter's dowry in inventories of linen, jewelry, and kitchen vessels. The notary reads in a steady voice, writes with careful fingers, and seals with the authority of a craft that connects private hopes to public recognition. When you have papers, your neighbors treat your affairs as real. When the courts have to decide, the papers guide them. The city wants your promises to be legible, because legible promises are less likely to lead to knives. In alleys, if you stand at a crossroads during the noon hour, you notice how work is layered rather than simultaneous. The sound of a hammer competes with the rhythm of a loom. But you also hear the quiet voices of 2 women counting out coins for vegetables, and the cry of a boy selling a measure of raisins. In a house nearby, someone copies a text, mouth moving, silently as eyes pass over familiar forms. The city tolerates noise because noise is the byproduct of usefulness. And it tolerates a certain disorder because absolute order would strangle the adaptation daily life requires. The limits of tolerance are clear enough. The watch disperses crowds when streets must be kept clear. The eparch shutdowns a stall that blocks access. The guild censures a member whose shortcuts harm the trade's reputation. All of it is kept in record. You can, if you want, request a copied entry to prove that once you were fined and have since paid. This is the city's gentle psychology, rather than shouting. It keeps receipts. You do not think much about criminal justice until you need it. And when you need it, you find that it too has been rendered routine. A thief caught in the act is taken to a magistrate, but the magistrate does not improvise, consults a book of penalties and procedures, takes testimony, writes his decision in a manner that can be understood by another who has not seen the faces in the room. Punishments are designed to instruct, and so they are public enough to be remembered, but not so cruel as to invite vengeance. A flogging in the market is a message. The recording of the flogging in a docket is the reinforcement of the message. Long imprisonments are rare, not because the city is soft, but because prisons cost money and remove labor from the economy. Fines, restitutions, and public work keep the wheels turning while reminding everyone what the expected behaviors are. Even confession, in church, often ends in a prescribed sequence of acts. A timetable that returns a person to the common life as much by habit as by change of heart. Education is not universal. but it is more common than you might expect in a city that depends on reading. Boys, and sometimes girls, learn letters and numbers in small rooms where a teacher holds a reed and writes on a board. Copying is the foundation. Students repeat forms until their hands obey without thought. Those who go on to higher study learn to shape arguments, to find suitable examples, to speak extemporaneously from a written outline. This training produces a particular kind of mind, careful about categories, allergic to contradictions, fond of precedent. The effect on the city's life is that people can be persuaded rather than forced. A shopkeeper, shown the text of a regulation, accepts it. A litigant, shown the relevant clause, submits. A head of household, shown a schedule, adheres. You feel the easing of friction when minds have been trained to accept that words carry public weight. The poor are always present. They live in upper stories where stairs are steep and in alleys where airflow is poor. The city does not romanticize them. It tries to prevent their misery from becoming contagious, morally or physically. Soup kitchens run by churches or confraternities operate on schedules. Alms are distributed in quantities that are enough to survive, but not enough to encourage idleness. Workhouses employ those who can labor, even clumsily, and their output rope, rough cloth, patched garments filters into the market where bottom prices keep someone from going naked. Public fountains are kept accessible in poor districts because disease begins where water is scarce. The city's generosity is bureaucratic, which is to say consistent rather than spontaneous. You might think it cold, but if you have ever waited in a line for bread, you know that predictability is a form of kindness. By afternoon, the city is warm, and the smell of the sea mixes with the smell of sun on stone. The watch changes again. The eparch's messengers carry another packet of orders to a gatehouse where tolls are checked with the same boredom as in the morning. Children play in the dust, making roads with their fingers. A scribe, taking a break, rubs ink from his hands and talks to a friend about prices of oil, about a rumor that a convoy is delayed, about whether the festival next week will change his schedule. The horizon is uneventful, which is exactly what everyone here hopes for. When the day cools, shutters are closed and lamps are lit. The city goes quiet, but not silent. There are still steps in the streets, and distant voices reciting prayers in a rhythm that binds one day to the next. Night pulls you back to your door, and as you latch it, you listen to the normalcy. The slow drip in a basin, the settling of a beam, the faint scrape of a rat in the wall. Someone coughs overhead, and then you hear the watchman's staff on stone, counting his rounds as much for himself as for you. If you sleep, it is with the comfort that the routines you witnessed will repeat, that bread will be there in the morning, that the cistern will still hold water, that if a quarrel arises, it can be processed rather than exploded. But you also wonder, with that slight unease that no routine can banish, whether the city's careful schedules would bend or break if too many shocks arrived at once. And if they bent, how you would recognize the moment when adjustment is no longer enough. To keep the order you have come to rely on, you begin with a coin that no longer feels the same in the hand as the one your grandparents passed in their time. You notice it first by the way merchants test it against a scale, and then, by the way, their eyes narrow when weighing change. Over years, the purity and weight of coins can shift, and you come to understand that money is not an absolute, but an absolute, an agreement whose terms can be renegotiated by necessity. When rulers face fronts too wide and reserves too thin, they tinker with alloy and call it policy. The city's response to these adjustments is pragmatic. Money changers publish rates. Markets price accordingly, salaries are recalibrated. Taxes are assessed in kinds that reflect the new reality. You learn to keep a small ledger in your head. How much bread costs this week? What a bolt of cloth fetches? What the watchman expects for his service? That ledger gives you back a sense of control in a world where the symbol of value changes. Its content. The administration, for its part, tries to contain uncertainty by declaring new standards, punishing false clipping, and adjusting arrears over a span so that shock becomes slope. Stability here is not the absence of change, but the predictability of change's pace. Land, more than coin, carries the weight of promise. The empire's habit of supporting soldiers through land allotments connects the fields to the frontier. Families, hold plots on condition of service. The yield pays their taxes and equips them for duty, and their presence on that land anchors a defensive plan that does not rely on barracks alone. Over generations, the reality phrase, service, is commuted, obligations are sold, estates expand by purchase and pressure, and the arithmetic of fairness is threatened. The administration responds with a repertoire of measures, limits on accumulation, protections for smallholders, requirements that land dedicated to service remain attached to service. The aim is less to freeze a moment than to slow an erosion. If you are a small farmer, you might hang on because a notice is read aloud in the district declaring that no one may absorb your strip without a recorded sale and a period for objections. That notice is not a shield against all greed, but it complicates greed, making theft more expensive. In that complication lies your chance. The fiscal mind expresses itself in reforms whose names do not matter to you as much as their effects. Assessments are reorganized to reflect population shifts. Some taxes are consolidated to reduce overhead and leakage. Local officials are given stricter audit cycles, and their books are inspected by men with no ties to their districts. New forms appear, their boxes designed to force clarity. A neat square for the number of plows, another for the amount of seed sown, a line for losses due to flood. You might resent the precision, but when drought strikes 3 years later, the same precision produces a fairer relief because officials can compare like to like. The bureaucracy is not a thinking machine. It improves by habit. Each reform is a recognition that the old habits have drifted from the realities they must govern. It is not exciting to watch, but if you have ever begged for an extension and received it on terms you could meet, you know why this is the kind of excitement you prefer. In the city, guilds adjust to the new arithmetic. Bakers petition to alter the standard weight of a loaf when the price of grain rises too quickly. And the eparch agrees on condition of posted notices and intensified inspections to prevent cheating. Weavers negotiate a sliding wage for apprentices tied to the price of wool. Money-smart monks recalibrate rents for tenants in a way that keeps fields tilled rather than abandoned. A pattern emerges. Survival means rebalancing obligations without rupturing relationships. You learn to do the same at home. A dowry you once expected in fine cups becomes 2 good sheets and a promise of oil delivery next year. A loan you once would have repaid in coin, you now repay with labor on a roof or a day's carting for a neighbor's shop. The city's capacity to translate value between forms keeps quarrels from becoming violence. And that capacity is taught not in speeches, but in the city's daily accounts. Justice, more than ever, is the stage where fairness is made visible. The courts face an increase in boundary disputes, in claims against debtors who claim incapacity, in arguments over the interpretation of older contracts under new money. Judges trained in a culture of text find guidance in revised laws that reconcile past promises with present conditions. They allow restructurings in installments. They insist on documentation. They penalize predatory behavior in bad years. You watch a hearing in which a small farmer's case against a neighbor's encroachment is decided in his favor because he has kept his receipts. His boundaries have been measured, and the law recognizes that absence due to seasonal service cannot be grounds for dispossession. The lesson is clear, even if unglamorous. Paperwork is defense. and fairness is enforced in the unremarkable strokes of a pen. The administration's reach into the countryside remains a negotiation, and the negotiation has seasons. In spring, assessors arrive with marked cords and make their rounds through damp fields. In summer, they reappear at threshing floors, watching the separation of grain with an eye trained to distinguish a fair share from a clever concealment. In autumn, they sit in a village house with shutters thrown wide for light, matching names to bags on the floor, their fingers smudged with dust and chaff. Winter is for reconciliation of books and for the issuance of notices for the next year's schedules. The cycle creates a social time as real as the liturgical one. You know when to expect attention from the state and when you are likely to be left alone. That knowledge shapes your choices about planting, borrowing, hiring, and marriage. To someone outside, it looks dull. To you, it is the calendar of survival. In the ports and customs posts, reform takes the shape of clarity. Rate schedules are simplified and posted where a literate sailor can read them and where an illiterate one can have them read. Officials are rotated more regularly and for shorter terms. Bond requirements for office are raised so that malfeasance is recovered from the culprit rather than from the public. Appeal procedures are tightened with deadlines that prevent endless delay. Merchants complain anyway because complaint is the music of trade, but they also adjust their expectations. The flow of goods is smoother when rules are fewer and clearer. And the city notices in a subtle way fewer sudden shortages, fewer spikes in prices, fewer street quarrels over delivery failures. You feel the difference in the taste of a stew that has the right oil again and in the sight of a winter market not as thin as it might have been. Coin reform reaches deep into pay and provisioning. Soldiers are paid in a coin whose quality is protected by public oaths taken at the mint. Vendors are required to accept it at face value for official shipments. Taxes can be settled in it at known rates even when mixed coins circulate in the wider market. The city's ledger keeps layers of equivalences, and clerks trained to compute in these layers gain a kind of professional pride. They will explain to a confused petitioner how arrears convert, how future obligations can be scheduled, how an overpayment in kind can be credited against a shortfall in coin. This is the art of smoothing lives across rough years. Without it, fear would thicken. With it, time remains navigable. Monasteries and charitable houses respond to reforms by formalizing their own practices. They write clearer rules for who is to be fed and how often, for how beds are assigned, for how loans from their treasuries to small tenants are recorded and forgiven. They become micro-bureaucracies, intelligible to the larger bureaucracy. When officials arrive with questions about exemptions, a steward produces neat books that answer those questions. And the taxman, satisfied, leaves to harass a less organized neighbor. In this, you see that piety and prudence conspire to keep resources where they can do steady good. It is not that the city has learned compassion from reforms, or that reforms have learned compassion from the city. It is that the habits of keeping track extend to kindness. At home, reform shows up in the way you think of risk. You keep copies of your documents in a dry jar. You diversify your small savings. A few coins in the floor, a jar of oil at the back. A promise from a cousin you know can honor it because his own affairs are ordered. You teach your children not only to read prayers, but to read numbers. And you make them practice writing receipts so that the shapes will be fluid when they are needed. This is not romantic parenting. It is the way families remain whole. When you look back at a year in which your household held together even as money shifted and obligations were revised, you do not feel triumphant. You feel grateful for people you will never meet who adjusted a rate or wrote a line that allowed you to bend and not break. By evening, the city returns to its breathing ease. A new coin glints in a lamp's light. A form is folded and put away. A loaf is divided into even pieces with a knife that knows the motion by muscle memory. The day's talk has been of prices, and rules of changes and their limits. Nothing of it seems worthy of a chronicle, and yet you suspect that this is the substance of history, the deliberate avoidance of ruin by patient minds. You turn down the lamp and listen to the usual noises, heartened by the sense that the city's fairness, though imperfect and always in need of repair, is not a myth but a craft you can rely on most days. And still, because you live in a world that remembers shocks, you wonder whether the capacity to reform without losing identity can hold when argument ceases to be about measures and becomes about meanings. And if it cannot, what will happen to the boring happiness you have learned to value?
You stand in a small church whose walls are full of faces, and you are told, gently and without insistence, that these faces are not merely pictures, but presences. An old woman points to a saint she has known all her life and explains that this icon has seen her through sickness and childbirth, through hunger and feast. She does not argue theology. She remembers the feel of wood under her fingers and the way the candlelight throws a warmth across paint that is not mere pigment. For a long time, this has been the city's language. Images as companions, reminders, and petitions. Workshops have grown skilled in producing panels that are at once art and tool. They grind pigments, lay gold leaf, and polish varnish in sequences. That might look like magic if the steps were not so exact, and the steps are exact because meaning here is delicate, and care is a kind of worship. If you pass from this church into the street, the city keeps speaking the same language in smaller ways. Little tokens worn around the neck, painted images above doorways, stitched symbols on a sleeve. The sacred is domesticated not by being diminished, but by being made available at the same time. You can feel a different pressure coming from the edges of the empire, not a pressure of swords alone, but a pressure of interpretations. Soldiers, recruited from regions where life is closer to the frontier, carry with them a suspicion of images that have developed in communities that do not know cities in the same way. Their piety is austere, and their days are practical. Their faith is more a matter of obedience and proclamation than of contemplation and craft. When rulers from those circles ascend, they inherit an urban world saturated in imagery and a set of obligations to a church whose blessing legitimizes the crown. The stage is set for a quiet collision between forms of devotion that cannot easily be reconciled by argument alone. You, a city dweller who bows to a panel as naturally as you pay a tax or greet a neighbor, do not perceive the coming storm. You hear talk and shrug. What can doctrine do to a habit as simple as touching a painted edge with 2 fingers? Doctrine, when it arrives in edicts, travels on the same roads as taxes. The language is administrative before it is spiritual. Images are to be removed from certain places. Depictions of holy figures are to be replaced by crosses. Workshops that specialize in such images are to present themselves for inspection. The city responds in its usual way. It makes lists. It inventories panels. It notes locations. It schedules a crew. The first days are awkward rather than violent. Clergy in some places comply with a wry smile, like men indulging a temporary fashion. Others resist in polite ways, slow-walking compliance, creating a backlog for inspectors who are not eager to press too hard. In some neighborhoods, there is relief people for whom images have always been a distraction sigh that discipline will help a society they think too fond of intercessions and objects. And beneath it all is the sound of brushes and mallets. Painters are asked to whitewash. Carpenters are asked to remove frames. The faithful are asked to accept that the panels they have kissed all their lives are now dangerous to their souls. The city's practical mind finds the strangeness in small things. What do you do with paint scrapings? They cannot be thrown away casually, and yet their old reverence has been declared a mistake. Do you lock them in a chest? Do you burn them? If you burn them, how do you keep the smell from becoming a scandal? In a street where people still remember what their hands have known, a clerk writes a procedure. Panels are to be removed to a storehouse and catalogued. Those that are damaged will be recycled as raw wood. Those that are in good condition will be sealed with a cloth and stored for now. A solution is as bureaucratic as the problem is spiritual. The administrative energy of the city has been turned against its own texture of reverence, but it proceeds because people have been trained to obey procedures, even when they do not entirely agree with their purpose. Monasteries become the quiet epicenters of resistance, not always by defiance, but by the simple insistence on their calendar. Their prayers are tied to images by a rhythm it is hard to retune. When edicts arrive, the abbots argue from texts. They cite cases. They propose compromises. Some are persuasive enough to buy time. Others are ignored. Officials arrive with papers and seals. Monks present their own papers and seals. The confrontation looks like a meeting of offices rather than a clash of zealots. Still, beneath the documents, there is feeling. Monks who have copied lives of saints that emphasize the material touch of holiness find it difficult to accept a theology that treats matter as dangerous in this way. They respond not just by argument, but by intensifying charity as if to demonstrate that their devotion produces social good. The poor eat. The sick are nursed. A monk's hand that no longer paints a face washes a fevered brow instead. You find this shifting of energies curious, even admirable, but you also wonder how long. A society can function when its religious labor is turned inward to hold ground. In workshops, change is at once an economic question and a moral one. Artists who have spent decades learning how to lay a halo correctly now turn to patterns for crosses and to decorative motifs that are safe. Some accept the shift as a chance to demonstrate skill in a different field. Others feel diminished, like singers told to hum. Young apprentices learn from masters who are careful with their words in public and more frank in private, and the apprentices absorb a skill set that may be of limited use if the rulings are reversed. The city watches wages and commissions, and the eparch keeps a discreet eye on the number of unemployed craftsmen whose skills cannot be repurposed. The goal is to prevent the spiritual struggle from becoming a street problem. If the economy can absorb the men who once painted saints into crews that paint walls and ships, the city will quiet. That is the hope that the faithful adapt in their households. Panels move from prominent walls to inner rooms or to chests. Kisses are given to wood through cloth covers or replaced by a touch to a cross. The language of prayer shifts from direct address to a painted face to a more generalized request. Some lament, quietly, that the tangible comfort is gone. Others report, sincerely, that their piety feels sharper without objects. Priests learn to speak both ways. Their homilies emphasize obedience and the essence of faith, or they hint at a coming restoration without promising what they cannot guarantee. The skill is pastoral management under surveillance, and you recognize it as a familiar urban talent, the ability to speak in two registers, so that the city does not break itself over matters that, however important, cannot be settled by shouting. Meanwhile, the frontier continues its quiet demands. The same rulers who issue edicts about images must also supply troops, repair fortifications, negotiate with neighbors, and manage migrations. The logic of their icon policies is tied, in part, to their sense of discipline. A lean army is to be matched by a leaner piety. You see this in the tightening of festivals, in the reduction of processions, in the insistence that extravagance in devotion is not a mark of truth. The connection makes a certain sense if you live near garrisons and listen to the way soldiers talk about the world. It makes less sense if your world is a neighborhood where craft and prayer have grown together. The city becomes a landscape of polite disagreement, tied by taxes and by the need for water and bread. When you enter a church newly stripped of images, you find that the absence has a presence of its own. Walls are pale and show the marks where frames once hung. The light falls differently. Your eyes have fewer supports. The priest's voice must do more work, and sometimes it rises to the task in a way that surprises you. The words take on weight they did not have when faces were speaking. Along with them, in a different church across town, an image remains above a doorway, unnoticed by officials or protected by a local arrangement. People cluster there, not in defiance, but in habit, and they touch the wood lightly as if to avoid being seen by anyone but heaven. This division of practice within a single city is strange, but not unbearable, because the city has learned to live with variation. Price differences between markets, dialects between neighborhoods, customs of traders from different seas. The danger is not variety, but zeal that cannot bend. Even now, you are not sure how the argument will end. You can imagine a settlement in which images return with restrictions, or in which their use is limited to private spaces, or in which crosses and words take permanent precedence over faces. You can also imagine that the administrative energy that began this process will run out of fuel as rulers change and as other problems take the fore. In the meantime, you live day by day with a kind of double vision, the city that was full of faces in niches and on panels, and the city that is, where words and crosses attempt to carry the same weight. You wonder whether habits can be restored intact after being so thoroughly interrupted, and whether the people who have adapted their souls to bare walls will wish to return to crowded ones, and if they do not, what that means for the craftsmen, who have waited with their brushes wrapped, believing in a future in which their patience will again be needed. You begin with a notice posted at a church door, written in a practiced chancery hand, announcing a change that will appear small to those who do not live by it. The notice states that certain images are to be removed and replaced by a cross, that certain themes are to be repainted, that churches with wall cycles should be examined by a designated inspector. There is nothing inflammatory in the language. No insults, no tattered rhetoric of enemies. It reads the way an instruction. Manual reads as if changing the texture of people's devotion were the same as changing the schedule for cleaning a cistern. The first reaction is practical. Priests ask which panels must go first, whether a portable icon can remain, whether a carved wooden door counts as an image if no faces appear on it, whether inscriptions containing names of saints must also be effaced. The inspectors answer. With a book open in their hands, they show lists. They trace lines of compliance and deviation. You are struck by the ordinariness of it. How much a spiritual program relies on the city's habit of turning disagreements into procedures. The workshops, where panels were made and repaired, become rooms of reassignments. A painter who once ground red earth for robes and blue, stone for skies, now grinds the more modest tones of borders and inscriptions. The masters change their instructions to apprentices without theatrics. You count the steps. Prepare wood by sizing, lay cloth, apply gesso in even layers, scrape to smoothness, incise guidelines, lay gold where allowed, paint fields of color with egg binding, write inscriptions with care. The content is altered, but the craft remains a sequence. Some masters hide their best tools and store their pattern drawings in jars in a roof space against hope. Others sell off their stock of expensive pigments and invest in more general paints used for ships, doors, and furniture. You can feel the fabric of a city that survives by adaptation. A gilder takes work on liturgical vessels that remain legitimate. A pigment merchant shifts to selling to scribes and carpet weavers. A skilled hand that once painted eyes now draws letters for shop signs. Economic life bends, because bending is what keeps it from breaking. Monasteries negotiate at the boundary between law and conscience. Their stewards keep better accounts than most households, and in those accounts, the new commands must be registered, alongside ordinary obligations. The abbot receives an inspector and produces inventories of panels in chapels, of books in the library, of tapestries in the refectory. A monk who cares for the sacristy assigns objects to categories: to be removed, to be repainted, to be covered, to be stored. The process is described in a hand that does not shake. Resistance here looks like precision, the careful narrowing of what counts as compliance to the smallest possible area. When the inspector notes that a certain panel remains over a side altar, the monk replies that the panel is being evaluated for woodworm damage and cannot be safely moved until a carpenter can make a new brace. The inspector records this answer and writes a date for a return visit. In this way, a few weeks of breathing space are purchased from the margin of a ledger. You recognize the city's old skill, turning time into room. Homes adjust behind doors that are not watched. A family with a panel long venerated no longer brings it out on feast days. It stands in an inner room, wrapped in cloth. The cloth has become a code understood by everyone. Kisses are now pressed to the cloth, and a prayer is said for wisdom and mercy for those who govern. You sense the mixture of piety and prudence in the way people speak. They say what can be said in public, that humility is required, that faith is not tied to paint, that God is not diminished by bare walls. In private, they add that memory is a help, that the hands remember what the eyes cannot see, that children must be taught to honor without evidence for a while. The practice is small and stubborn. It does not overturn policy, and it does not weaken the city's rhythms. But it keeps a bridge built over a gap no one is sure how long they will need to cross. The clergy find themselves as much schedulers as preachers. Homilies emphasize Scripture, reading with more attention than before, and schedules are drawn up for public recitation so that the mnemonic power once lent by images can be replaced by repetition. Parish lists are expanded with notes about which households struggle and need a visit, because discouragement is as much a pastoral concern as hunger. Bread given to the poor has always been measured. Now, so are the hours of consolation. Priests keep little notebooks where they tick off visits made, the sick who need prayers, the households in danger of sliding from compliance to sullen rebellions. Their task is to prevent lines from hardening, and they do so like all city people do, by showing up on time, by knowing names, by performing the good ordinary acts that make extreme gestures less attractive. The army is not one mind, but its thoughts tend toward order. Garrison commanders are pleased when the city's churches echo their own simplicity, less concerned with decoration than with discipline. They echo back to headquarters that religious excess can lead to civic disorder, and the message is flattering to rulers who think of themselves as guardians of an essential truth. Soldiers who grew up in regions of plain worship feel confirmed and more at home in the capital's barracks. They do not think of theology when they are mending sandals, counting arrows, and polishing spearheads, but they appreciate a palace rhetoric that feels like their own directness. This rapport between garrison and court makes it easier to enforce. Edicts in certain neighborhoods and harder in others. In districts where workshops and monasteries cluster, you notice patrols more often. The watch is instructed to keep the peace, and the watch, trained to obey, does so with weary professionalism. Economic effects follow slowly, like wind-borne dust settling on surfaces you later must wipe clean. Sellers of candle oil to chapels find orders reduced. They redirect supply to households and to hospitals where lamps must burn at night. Makers of small devotional tokens alter their molds, replacing faces with crosses and inscriptions. Pilgrimage traffic within the city lessens, and then changes pattern. Where there was once a line to touch a panel, there is now more space in the nave. The city breathes a different way. You sense that for many, especially those who prefer order to intensity, the change is not unwelcome. There are fewer sudden crowds, fewer arguments over who may approach first, fewer interruptions in the day's practical pursuits. Yet under this quieted surface, a structural tension builds that you cannot measure by bread prices or wages, because it is not economic. It is the sensation that something like a family rule has been broken by someone with the power to impose a new rule, and that, while the household continues, trust has thinned dot in the countryside. The administration promotes a blunt piety through the same channels it uses to collect taxes. Notices are delivered at market towns on the same days when assessors arrive. Village churches are reminded of expectations at the same desks where tolls are paid. You see how the empire's intelligence lists, schedules, audited returns cannot be turned to different ends without changing its appearance. A pragmatic headman, worried about harvest and road repair, reads the new instructions aloud without commentary. The villagers nod, thinking more about weather than about icon panels that were never numerous in their small chapel. Iconoclasm is most disruptive, where craftsmen, readers, and long memories concentrate, and least unsettling, where life has always been lean, and the church a house of stone with a few painted crosses, and the priest, who teaches by speaking rather than by pointing to walls. Friction increases in the monasteries that take their vocation as guardianship of memory. The rumor of confiscations passes through cloisters, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes precise. A monastery with land sufficient to maintain a hospital and a guest house worries that its fields may be reassigned to soldiers or to loyal lay officials. The abbot writes letters, calm and reasoned, to governors, invoking precedents for protection, and reminding them that the monastery feeds widows and orphans and repairs bridges in the district. He encloses lists of expenditures and signatures of witnesses, because the empire understands such lists and signatures. The reply is also calm. There will be a review. Meanwhile, continue charitable works. The local official will send an inspector to verify. Months pass. A field is reassessed. A strip is taken for the use of a small cavalry unit. The monastery adjusts, increasing production in vineyards and decreasing the herd by a few animals. The guest house bed count is reduced by 4. You understand the survival technique. Reduce expectations, keep books impeccable, make inspection easy, and avoid giving a bored functionary an excuse to prove zeal. In churches stripped of images, the arrangement of space shifts. A priest now must stand where a panel once anchored the eye. Readers take more of the service, and the chant, always present, thickens into a backbone. Children learn to follow the cycle of readings. An old woman, who once taught her granddaughter to recognize a saint by the colors on a panel, now teaches her to recognize a saint by a passage and a feast day. The transfer is not elegant. It is functional. You watch how the center of attention moves from the wall to the mouth, from pigment to voice. The city's culture changes by degrees, and, like all slow changes, it can be mistaken for continuity if you do not hold a memory against it. Courts adapt to new disputes. A painter sues for payment when a patron refuses to pay for a panel now forbidden to be displayed. The judge, lector-trained, rules that partial payment is owed for work done in good faith before the edict's publication. A monastery appeals a levy assessed on income reduced by confiscation. The judge schedules payments across years to prevent collapse. A merchant accuses a rival of keeping an icon in a shop to attract pious customers. The court investigates, finds a small painted cross behind a curtain, and fines the merchant for reckless accusation. The mechanics of adjudication grind steadily. You see how the legal mind becomes a safety valve, letting off pressure by turning outrage into manageable cases with files and outcomes. It does not heal the deeper disagreement, but it prevents the city from settling that disagreement by mob. Palace issues a longer text, a theological justification. It is read in churches and copied in scriptoria. The argument is precise, referring to language of idolatry and to proper forms of honor. It asks you to accept that the cross stands where once stood the face, that words suffice where once paint spoke. In response, a council of bishops in some places meets and writes its own language, affirming the dignity of representation when properly understood. The city hears both texts through the filter of its tasks. You interpret in ways that allow you to keep your day intact. A merchant nods and stocks his stall. A mother nods and instructs her child to remember a saint's story by reciting it at bedtime. A soldier nods and cleans his harness. The deeper levels of thought are present, but everyday life continues to favor the familiar. That rules should be posted, that markets should open, that taxes should be predictable, and that prayers should be set on schedule, whether to faces or to bare walls. After years of this, you can imagine that the policy could become permanent, not because it has convinced everyone, but because it has been woven into the city's routines. Yet politics has its own calendar. A change at court can reorder the priorities of edicts and councils, and a different ruler can prefer a different balance. The people who have kept panels wrapped have kept hope wrapped with them, and hope is patient. When rumors reach you that a reversal will be attempted, it is not the first time you have heard such whispers, but something in the quiet confidence of a priest makes you think it may be true this time. The city does not run to the doors to demand it. It holds its breath and counts the days, as it always does, by market openings, by watch rounds, by liturgical hours. You think about the painter who kept his pattern drawings in a jar. You wonder whether he has checked their condition recently and whether the string still holds the bundle tight. If permission returns, will the hand that has been painting letters remember how to paint eyes that look back at you? And if it does, will you touch the panel again with the same ordinary certainty as before? Or will the years of bare walls have changed the touch in ways you cannot yet perceive? You hear it first not in a proclamation, but in a rearrangement of furniture. In a small church where a cross hung in a prominent space, a table is moved, scaffolding is brought in, and cloth wraps are unfolded from a chest. The faces that once looked down on you return, not in a single blaze, but in the steady hands of craftsmen who have been waiting. The workshop opens its shutters early, and apprentices fetch water with a happiness that is almost relief. The same sequence you learned earlier returns to life. Wood prepared, cloth laid, ground applied, underdrawing incised, gold breathed upon to warm it for laying, pigments mixed in bowls lined with the day's order of operations. The first line the master paints is a line he knows by muscle memory, a halo edge, the curve of a cheek, the narrow arc of a brow. You watch the wood take on its role again. The smell of size and of egg and of gold leaf floats into the street, and people passing by tilt their heads slightly, the way you do when you catch the scent of bread after a fast dot in the city's offices. The return of images looks again like a sequence of paperwork. A council meets and writes decisions in chapters. The palace drafts concurrences. The eparch receives instructions to assist with reinstallation and to protect workshops. Lists are made of churches whose painted programs were suspended mid-cycle. Inspectors are reassigned to certify restorations, and their task is to prevent dangerous crowding and to ensure that the new works meet safe construction standards. A particular wall has been left bare too long. Its plaster has dried and cracked. It must be prepared properly, or the paint will peel within a year. The inspectors are not theologians. They are practical men who see that a good policy requires execution with skill. You admire the city's habit of turning ideals into checklists. It is unromantic, but it protects the effort from being drowned in good intentions without screws and nails. Clergy adapt again with the grace of people raised on calendars. Homilies praise the restoration without triumphalism that would leave any neighbor on the far side feeling excluded. Schedules for blessings are posted. A household bringing a panel out of storage is to present it for inspection, not for censorship, but to ensure that it is structurally sound after years in cloth, that hooks are secure, that candles will not be placed in ways that smoke and heat will damage new work. You stand in a nave where a priest gives thanks for the return of faces and immediately reminds the congregation to keep aisles clear during feast processions, to obey the watch, to take care with candles, to keep the city's order in mind. You realize that the fascination of the extraordinary must be joined back to the discipline of the ordinary if the restoration is to become normal life. The economy moves in familiar loops. Candle merchants who weathered lean years now see orders swell. Pigment sellers unpack storerooms and order more from sources that remember the taste of their coin. Book painters, who had kept their skills alive on initials and borders, take commissions for fuller miniatures and manuscripts that combine text and image. The city recovers a sensory richness without losing its administrative backbone. A guild of painters revises its standards, posting sample palettes and instructing apprentices again in the moral geometry of images. What an orderly face looks like, what a balanced composition requires. There is nothing loud in this, just the hum of training, the correction of posture, the repetition of a stroke until it is right. You notice a painter's insistence that hands and images be made with attention, because hands will be kissed. Thus, they must be painted with a dignity that rewards touch. Monasteries again become warehouses of memory, but this time with scars in their inventories that they record in their own hands. A ledger might carry a note in a margin. Panel of Saint So-and-so removed in year X by order, restored in year Y. Frame replaced in year Y. Donor list attached. They attach the donor list with care, because stories are carried in attachments. The monastery's guest house expands again by 4 beds. The hospital resets its allotment of bread. Vineyards are pruned with new confidence that their income will not be halved next year by an unexpected levy. Yet memory remains a guide. The stewards keep their books tight because they have learned that good records are the best defense against future episodes when power decides to define devotion. Charity continues not only from piety but from policy. When the monastery feeds the poor, it creates not patronage, but a web of expectation that any official will think twice before severing. You recognize the political intelligence under the robed dot in households. The return is personal and unceremonious. A panel is unwrapped. The cloth that kept it safe is folded and placed in a chest, where it may wait for another season no one hopes to see. A grandmother shows a child how to kiss wood lightly, not wetting it, not smudging paint, and wiping a small circle with a clean cloth so that oil does not build up. She speaks about the saint the way you might speak about a distant relative who has always been present at tea family moments. She does not rehearse arguments. She rehearses gratitude for the day the fever broke, for the time the boat returned, for the day there was a little more bread than expected. These small stories supply the devotional economy just as grain supplies the city's market. They make the image a part of the habit of hope that the army grumbles, accepts, and moves on. Soldiers who grew up in plain church districts have learned in the city years that it bends and straightens like any long-lived thing. They still prefer spare worship, and they still think ornament can distract. But the schedule of guard duty does not change because of a panel in a church. Commanders are instructed to prevent harassment and to support the eparch in maintaining order at feast times when excitement will be high. The watch chalks routes and keeps lanterns ready. The city has endured longer disruptions than a liturgical restoration, and its muscle memory for crowd control is strong. The first major festival with images back in place produces the expected surge of visits to notable churches. A careful grid of ropes guides flow. Wash stations are set at doors for hands blackened by candle soot. The city manages belief the way it manages water, through channels. Courts face new disputes of a different flavor. A patron demands the return of a panel confiscated years ago and now stored in a state inventory. The judge orders restitution, with proofs of previous ownership, and where a panel's chain of custody is broken, grants a comparable commission at the state's expense. A painter sues a copyist for reproducing his workshop's distinctive face style. The court decides that style cannot be owned, but designs traced directly from a master's stock patterns without permission cannot be sold as the copyist's own. These are not matters of life and death, but they are matters of fairness that govern how the city's beauty is made. Fairness in small things is the city's way of thanking its people for patience in big things. Theology becomes domestic. The great debates, once weaponized by rulers, are now settled enough to be taken for granted by ordinary worshippers. They remain alive for scholars and bishops, but for most people, they have been converted into practices that are not argued each week, but simply done. You observe how the city's success in healing itself lies in distributing meaning from court and council into kitchens and workbenches. A woodcarver now explains to his apprentice a correct way to cut a frame, not only so that it hangs straight, but so that it honors its use. A candle maker blends wax and oil with attention, not only to burn time, but to the way a flame flatters a face painted with a certain pigment. Skill and devotion become indistinguishable, and in that indistinguishability, the city finds its strength. Memory, however, stays sharp. People remember the years of bare walls, and their remembrance is practical. A guild of painters maintains a second set of patterns, stored separately, in case of another reversal. A family keeps the cloth wrappings in good repair. A monastery notes in its rules that inventories are to be kept with duplicates in separate buildings. The city's wisdom is to turn trauma into habit, not as paranoia, but as a discipline of maintenance that includes preparedness. When the anniversary of restoration is celebrated each year, the processions are both joyous and calm. There are no jeers directed at those who preferred austerity. There are no scores settled in public. The priest's sermon contains more thanksgiving than triumph. The city, older than many of its rulers, behaves as if it understands that peace is better guarded by courtesy than by victory speeches. What remains after the images are back is the feeling that the city has tested one of its deepest assumptions, that it can endure long arguments without shredding itself. You observe the lessons written into walls and books and schedules. The first lesson is that devotion is best shaped by habits that the poor and the busy can practice without consulting a lawyer. The second is that the state's desire to impose a single form will meet, in a city of craftsmen and clerks, a counterforce of patient difference that does not shout but also does not forget. The third is that repair requires planners alongside prophets, because repair is a craft of coordination. When you stand beneath a newly repainted dome and look down to the threshold where you will leave your shoes less dusty than they arrived, you see a city that has made its faith durable by making its procedures humane. As you leave, you glance at a small panel newly hung above a doorway in your neighborhood. A hand has set it slightly off level, and another hand, noticing, will come with a wedge and fix it in a day or two. The correction will be unremarked, an ordinary improvement in a world that prefers continuity to shock. You think of how many times in your lifetime the city has demanded this kind of quiet correction in matters greater than a slanting frame. You think of the long patience of people who kept things wrapped, and of the discipline of others who kept schedules when their taste was offended, and of the shared satisfaction of a job ordinarily well done. Then you think, with the drowsy curiosity that comes when relief has settled into routine, whether the next arguments about land or coin or crowns will be handled with equal steadiness, and whether your children will inherit not only faces on panels, but the civic manners that keep faces and lives intact without force. You begin in a century that does not, at first glance, look like dusk at all. The reign of Basil II is remembered by numbers that do not sing, but that nevertheless signal strength. Granaries stocked through careful procurement, barracks supplied. On schedule, frontier posts tallied and inspected, land registers copied and verified until the ink bled into a kind of permanence. If you come to this period looking for spectacle, you will be disappointed. The triumphs that made their way into later legend were built from an unromantic scaffolding. A gold coin whose stability allowed salaries to be paid without haggling. A network of roads kept open by crews who knew where spring floods would bite. Depots situated according to distances that measured the pace of a mule more often than the charge of a horse. Even the famous suppression of a rival kingdom to the northwest can be traced on a ledger to fodder calculations, to the inspection of river crossings, to the boring work of issuing permits and standardizing lashings on siege engines so that ropes did not give under stress at awkward moments. The empire stood tall because its stadiest hands had a taste for routine in the countryside. Basil's administrators saw land as the alphabet of state. Plots were described by their yield rather than their beauty, and smallholders were shielded, to varying degrees, from the appetites of wealthier neighbors, because the peasant's capacity to pay his tax and serve his season on the frontier mattered more to the treasury than the consolidation of fields under a single estate. Surveyors with cords and measuring rods moved across the landscape with the patience of shepherds, and their notebooks altered to reflect a marriage here, a death. There, a field gone fallow after too much rain became the quiet constitution under which most people lived. For a soldier set along the mountain paths, the empire existed in the regularity of his ration and the periodic arrival of a faraway clerk to check stores and ask about the condition of boots. For a village headman, it existed in the combination of a predictable assessment and the possibility, in a bad year, of a deferral negotiated with references to precedent. The life of empire was a long conversation between lists. The army presented itself as disciplined order rather than irresistible charge. Its supply was organized with almost ecclesiastical solemnity. Bulletin boards in depots listed rations by ounce and pound, horse grain by measure, the expected wear of leather in a season of mud. Spears and bows were checked and logged. Worn items were redeemed in a cycle and produced receipts upon which armorers relied when pleading for charcoal and iron. At the edges, lightly armed watchman men, whose lives knitted farming to fighting past signals and took note of crossings, with a mind trained to write before it spoke. These acritae, as they were called in later stories, appear in ledgers as names tied to strips of land into obligations that could be counted. A term of service, a packet of arrows, a delivery of cheese in a month of scarcity. In their quiet competence, you can see the secret of Basil's longevity. He did not rely on armies of golden legends. He relied on men whose schedules meshed with those of millers and tanners and farriers. The capital itself was a beneficiary of this undersum abundance. Bakers measured flour with scales that were inspected according to the eparch's posted rounds. Coopers turned out barrels for wine and oil, their staves steamed and bent with the steadiness of any craft. Naval docks saw hulls caulked, oars inspected, and stores of hardtack sealed against damp. The gold coin that circled through these transactions, steady in weight, reliably accepted, was more than metal. It was a habit of trust. A baker accepted it from a customer and paid a miller. The miller settled with a carter. The carter paid for repairs at a smithy. The smith purchased iron and charcoal. And somewhere along the way, a tithe of these exchanges landed in the revenue office that would, months later, pay the soldier in the mountain pass. So long as the coin stayed credible and the roads open, the city breathed evenly. Religion, too, wore the face of routine. Monasteries kept their ledgers like farms. plantings, prunings, harvests, alms tallied against surplus, lamp oil measured against hours of service, beds counted in infirmary and guest house. The abbot's signature carried weight because it represented a discipline the state understood, and that understanding created a compact. Protect these houses of prayer because they run hospitals and feed the poor, because their fields remain productive, because their account books can withstand an auditor's questions. In seasons of plenty, a monastery might add a few beds and a few loaves. In lean seasons, it might pare its festival's ornaments and expand its soup lines. Sanctity was many things, but here it included knowing how many loaves could be baked. With a given allotment of flour, if Basil's enemies sometimes accused him of severity, they would have found their evidence in the way his administration resisted the gravitational pull of great houses. Estate consolidation, inevitable in any land where power gravitates toward the already powerful, was met with edicts that protected the smallman's obligation to the state and, by protecting that obligation, protected the smallman himself. In the capital's courts, judges trained on texts heard cases in which a farmer insisted that his long-acknowledged boundary should not be nudged by the neighbor's growing appetite. The judges, thinking of both justice and revenue, decided, in ways that preserved the tax base and the family plot. These were not thrilling decisions. They were technically reasoned and date-stamped and copied. They were the kinds of decisions that, added up over years, stabilized the texture of a society. At the apex of all these routines, the office of emperor was less a theater than a calendar. Basil appeared where needed, but his presence mattered. Most in the continuities it guaranteed that the coin would be protected, that the roads would be maintained, that the laws would be kept orderly. The palace was not only a place of ceremony, it was an office complex. Minutes were kept, petitions organized, budgets drafted and revised. When military successes came, they were received like a well-finished account, a target reached not by inspiration, but by adherence to plan. The chroniclers would later fasten on images of triumph, but those images rest on the columns of numbers you can still imagine, drawn by clerks who never saw a battlefield. And yet, even in these years that later ages would name as high, the dusk gathered in subtle increments. The habits that made strength an army tied to land, a tax base anchored in smallholders, a gold coin that allowed predictable conversion of labor to salary required maintenance of a fineness that only relentless attention could keep. After a disciplined ruler, successors are asked to be as disciplined. Some are, some are not. The many routines that keep a civilization upright can be frayed not by a single bad decision but by fatigue, a relaxation of recruitment standards. Here, an indulgence of magnate privilege; there, a debatable coinage adjustment that seems minor until it is repeated. You can, in a generation or two, wake to find that the systems you took for granted work almost as well, but not quite, and that the difference shows in the way a soldier's pay arrives a week late, in the way a millstone goes unrepaired, because the mason moved to a patron's townhouse, in the way a road is passable, but not smooth enough to handle the caravan at the pace. A trader expected that the strength of borders depends on tenderness in the center. When court politics entangle themselves with policy, when rival houses calibrate decisions according to private networks rather than public balance, you feel, in the countryside, a slight shifting of weight. Auditors learn which doors to knock on and which to skirt. Inspectors find their rounds subtly altered to avoid offending a patron. The law remains on the shelf, but a nuance in its application grows into a pattern that is difficult to disguise. In such a climate, the peasant-soldier system that underlay earlier steadiness runs the risk of becoming a nostalgia rather than a reality. Pronoia, the practice of assigning revenue from a plot to a holder in return for service, begins as a fiscal instrument and gradually turns into a means by which obligation is detached from community. If managed well, it can be a tool of agile finance. If managed poorly, it erodes the social bond between soldier and soil. The capital, always a mirror of the empire's health, remains vigorous, even brilliant. Its markets supply and resupply. Its guilds argue and reconcile. Its notaries flourish. But the city's magnificence is, by design, a receiver of distant currents. When a regional governor delays a shipment to settle a score, your baker weighs his flour with a watchful frown. When an officer decides that his men will be fed from a monastery's granary without compensation, because orders are vague and authority close at hand, a steward makes a note that speaks a quiet alarm. Small deviations do not appear in chronicles, yet they are the microfractures that sometimes widen unexpectedly. When stress arrives, even the sea asks for steady attention. The empire's ability to move grain depended not only on ships, but on contracts for their hire, on maintenance of piers, on dredging of channels, on timely provision of ropes and sailcloth from inland workshops that must be paid in coin. Trust. The navy is expensive, and the temptation perennial in any administration is to save today and hope tomorrow's seas are calm. Savings made in rope and timber become deficits in speed and control when wind and storm have their say. This, too, is part of the dusk, the creeping replacement of readiness with improvisation. And yet, the lives you pass each day are more resilient than any decline story suggests. A leatherworker's shop continues its rhythm, tanning hides with the same solutions handed down across generations, cutting straps for harnesses that bind. Small economies together. A householder balances her purse. A few coins, a jar of oil, a bag of grain, the promise of a neighbor to share labor and harvest. A monastery adds a few lines to its own schedule and shaves a few extravagances from Ma. Its feast. The city echoing with chants also echoes with the tapping of chisels, the clatter of pots, the steady sweep of brooms in front of shop doors. Even under rulers less exacting than Basil, the infrastructure of ordinary competence has a kind of inertia that keeps the wheels turning, but the machinery does not steer itself. When forces from beyond the border alter their speed and direction, when a new formation of horse and bow, drilled in a different doctrine, begins to flow across long frontiers, your dependence on steady schedules becomes obvious. Watchtowers. Rely on men whose loyalty is now brokered through networks no one in the capital quite understands. The old rhythm of call and response between center and edge finds itself answering to other drums. You sense, in the fading light of a late afternoon, that the empire's greatest achievement, its conversion of power into predictable habit, is the very thing that will be most sorely tested when the world beyond refuses to behave predictably. And you wonder, as you watch clerks in the twilight close their ledgers and brush sand over fresh ink to fix it, whether the ink is drying on a balance that can still hold, or whether tomorrow's entries will require a new arithmetic altogether, one that no one has yet learned to write. You move into a century where survival is practiced like a trade. The palace now houses a family that understands itself less as an inheritor of perfect systems and more as a manager of damage control. The ruler at the center is a scheduler, a negotiator, a reallocator. His most enduring achievements are memoranda and meetings rather than statues. The first order of business is to stabilize money, because salaries anchor loyalty and markets anchor meals. A reform of coinage is carried out with announcements posted in marketplaces and hammered into habit by insistence at the mint and by oaths at the weighing table. Traders adjust their rates, and officials publish equivalences, converting the old world into the new on tablets and in voices that count carefully. The effect is not instantaneous, but it is cumulative. When the coin ceases to cause arguments at counters, the city breathes easier. Trade privileges become instruments for buying time. A decree grants favored access to a maritime power whose ships are needed more than anyone wishes to admit. The price of that favor is measured not in rhetoric, but in remission of customs fees and in space along the harbor front. A quarter of the city becomes a miniature abroad, its warehouses bustling, with men whose language is not the capital's, but whose cargoes are food, timber, and tools that the capital cannot forego. The ledger records them as numbers, but they are also bodies, and bodies bring friction. A riot is prevented here, a dispute settled there, and behind each avoidance lies a memorandum logged by the eparch, a patrol redirected, a compromise negotiated. The art you are learning to admire is the art of making sharp edges dull enough to be handled without blood. On the palace side, diplomacy becomes a form of logistics. Ambassadors leave with gifts matched to the honor of the receiving court, and the gifts are not baubles. A chest of silk is a roster of weavers. A book is a roster of scribes. A suit of armor is a roster of metalworkers, and of the mines that supplied them. The embassies carry promises written in a language of times and places. Meet us here by this month with these supplies. Accept these privileges in return for that fleet. Escort these pilgrim armies through the old imperial lands, according to schedules agreed upon. The reality, always, is that humans cannot be scheduled like grain. Crusaders arrive eager, hungry, suspicious, and complicated. They promise to return what they conquer and then learn their own accounting methods. The city adapts by building, a process around unpredictability. It insists on oaths when men present themselves, hosts them in zones that can be policed, directs their traffic through gates where counts can be made. The local economy flexes to accommodate the new flow. Bakers increase output, and the guild coordinates night shifts to keep ovens hot. Water carriers are assigned new routes. Monastic guest houses put extra beds in halls, and cooks adjust recipes. To stretch staples, notaries extend their hours to draw up contracts between locals and visitors who need guides, interpreters, porters, and guards. These everyday arrangements are the sieve through which danger is filtered. In the best years, the city earns and the empire gains back ground by calculated cooperation, moving others along with a firm hand at the elbow, pocketing a fair portion of what passes through, making friends where possible and peace where necessary. In the worst years, the arrangements turn brittle, and the elbow gives way to a fist. Markets are not only places of buying and selling. They are places where multitudes measure whether they are being treated fairly. When rumors of favoritism multiply, you can feel the air dry and the patience thin. Within the walls, a restored order looks experienced rather than innocent. The army is beaded not only with native officers, but with men hired for capacity, and their bands require supervision as much as they provide service. The navy, rebuilt to a point, and then quietly supplemented by allies, sails with ships that wear the empire's flag and with ships that do not. Logistics officers monitor stores with attention to expiry dates that the old order did not always consider. War is managed as one manages an unruly festival, by posting schedules, creating routes, designating no-go streets, and planning the cleanup while the music is still playing. The luster of a triumphant return to old borders, which glows in some. Memories is matched by the work of marking lots in restored towns, of debugging the tax rolls of districts absent for a generation, of hiring masons to repair walls for the second time in a lifetime. The countryside absorbs changes with the same stoicism as always. The peasant field changes hands less through sale than through reclassification. Pronoia grants proliferate as a way to reward service and maintain a skeleton of military readiness without the expense of direct salary. In village houses where accounts are kept with greater neatness than anyone gives them credit for, the new holder of the right to collect revenue on a parcel must be invited to sit and listen to what the field yields, to the costs that must be deducted, to the repairs that must be made to the well if seed is to become grain. A good paranoia holder learns to act like a long-time neighbor. A bad one acts like a stranger with a ledger. The state, watching from a distance, issues general rules to restrain the worst tendencies and to keep the fields from emptying into large estates whose lords can threaten policy. Enforcement is a patchwork, and in that patchwork you can see both resilience and erosion. The capital's inner life grows more complex as visitors stay, depart, return, and stay again. Processions winged through streets to keep the city's rituals visible to people attracted to other magnets. The Manual of Ceremonies, a book of instructions for how to move with dignity, is consulted to ensure that old forms still persuade new eyes. Galleries are cleaned, robes mended, candles counted, gates opened in the right order, horses stationed exactly where they should be, so that a sudden storm of concern can be ridden out with relative calm. It is not that the city worships form. It is that form is the city's worked memory of what has kept it from splintering. In an era when allies are also rivals and friends also traitors, continuity becomes a commodity only the capital can produce in quantity. Markets now feature goods whose journey tells you the story of concessions made and risks taken. Spices and sugar remind you that far seas are being sailed by men who carry charters from the palace, charters that subtract customs duties in exchange for services you cannot quantify until you need them. Timber and iron remind you of the price of not having enough of your own. If you live in a quarter where foreign merchants keep houses, you also live with their disputes. A knife fight near a tavern becomes a file on a desk at the eparch's office. A broken contract becomes 3 visits to a notary, and if not resolved, another file and another magistrate's day. The system works because the volume of quarrels is absorbed by procedures that outlast the men who make trouble. All the while, the empire counts carefully. It counts seats for emissaries, grain for armies, candles for festivals, petitions for audiences. Counting is the way it refuses to be surprised. When a shock arrives anyway, and shocks do, in the form of a fleet that decides to settle a debt by steering into your harbor with motives broader than commerce, the city reacts with a plan revised from an older plan. The chain across the water is raised. Walls are manned. Districts are assigned to defense and supply. Messengers run with slips of instruction. Churches balance the work of prayer with the work of cooking for defenders. When defenses hold, the city congratulates itself quietly and returns to the road of repairs. When defenses are breached in a later generation, it will happen. Those lists become the seed of survival elsewhere, enabling a transfer of habits across sea and land. Amid this strain, the virtues that seem dull become talismans. The habit of reading and writing in a shared legal language keeps disputes on paper. The patience of guilds, accustomed to policing themselves into accepting oversight in exchange for stability, keeps certain breaches from becoming plague. The daily prayers of households, now often more general for fear of inflaming older arguments, tether the present to a story that gives order meaning beyond administration. Without such inner advertising, rules would feel like chains. With it, they feel like the scaffolding you climb to repair a roof and descend when the job is done. And so, when you stand at a window and look over lanes of tiled roofs toward the massed stone of the land walls, you do not see heroes so much as caretakers. The caretakers make the city a place where time can be purchased in slices. A year here by an alliance, 3 years there by a reform, a decade by the choice to give what you cannot make in exchange for what you cannot do without. This is not the language of triumph, but it is the language of survival. The question that returns to your mind in quiet hours is whether a society that must constantly buy time can also buy opportunity, whether repairs layered upon repairs can add up to renewed strength, or whether the day will come when the bill for borrowed years exceeds the coin left in the chest and the patience left in the streets. You pass through a breach and find yourself in a smaller world that carries the old world inside it. The capital's fall to men who measured debt by chains instead of coins is not the end of a habit, only the dislocation of a habit. Manuals, registers, patterns, and practices travel with refugees and officials. In a western Anatolian city now, housing court and council, scribes set up tables much as before, and the state begins again by writing itself into existence. The first acts are not avenging manifestos, but lists. Which households remain, which workshops can be revived, which fields can be protected under new arrangements, which monasteries can be supported, and which must cut back to sustain the poor who followed the fleeing horde. The banners are smaller, the police are thinner on the ground, the coin has less reach, but the same hands know the same movements. To seal a document, to balance a set of accounts, to record a boundary and defend it with reference to a text. You discover that exile sharpens certain talents. Schools focus on the essentials. Reading that produces usable men, calculation that produces salaries on time, training in administration that produces functionaries who can make do without ornament. The rebuilt church hierarchy, though less splendid, coordinates hospitals and orphanages as before, understanding that the health of the people is a treasury no enemy can strip quickly. The army, hungry for replacements and short on equipment, relies on households that can produce sons and on workshops that can make arrows and mend harness. Smaller scale makes the audit feel more personal. The ruler's signature sits near the bottom of lists that look like household budgets. The grand words of sovereignty are spoken, but they are held in tension with the modest words of town stewardship. Drains cleared, wells protected, storerooms sealed and unsealed with witnesses present. When opportunity appears, when a garrison leaves a gate unguarded or a storm bends. A fleet away, the state's readiness is measured by whether lists can be turned into action. A city comes back under old banners, not by a thunderclap, but by careful coordination. Keys must be found or forged. Contracts must be taken out of boxes and reactivated. Families long sundered are relocated room by room, bringing with them documents and expectations that must be reconciled with what has been left behind. The restoration of a capital is a redistribution of patterns. Offices that could barely survive in exile reoccupy their apartments and begin the work of making a reduced reality feel legitimate. It is a victory of filing systems over void dot. At the same time, the new situation is fragile. The restored capital is less a heart-pumping wealth than a brain-coordinating scarcity. Its palaces are patched. Its walls require constant attention. Its harbor is lively in a way that makes stewards both grateful and uneasy, for the busiest piers belong to partners too powerful to contradict. A suburb across the water blooms into a rival that siphons customs dues along the lines of a charter that felt, at the time of its grant, like a necessary price for military assistance. This is what survival on borrowed time looks like. You can pay in land or in coin or in the future. Often you pay in all three, and the schedule of those payments is a map of decline slowed to a crawl by clever men who know their crawl is still forward motion dot in the countryside. The thread's thin. Population dips sometimes slowly because of migration, sometimes sharply because of disease, are padded by systems as long as the systems are not asked to carry too much weight. Fields go untilled because sons are gone or because the village's irrigation cannot be maintained by fewer hands. Pronoia grants accumulate in a way the center struggles to regulate. A good holder of such a grant knows to plant beans to fix soil, to repair a weir to keep the mill running, to leave a margin on a tenant's obligations so the field does not fail from stress. A bad holder squeezes and moves his household into town when the field refuses to produce under pressure. The state issues circulars reminding holders of their duties in language that appeals both to law and to honor. Enforcement is tiring work when the circuits are longer than the horses can bear. The capital's inner life does not wither so much as grow more careful. Markets open earlier and close earlier. Guilds teach apprentices how to keep two sets of skills ready, one to serve local demand and one to serve foreign merchants, whose presence cannot be predicted precisely, but whose money can change a month. Temple services continue with flavors that reflect arguments that once divided the city, now settled enough to be lived without shouting. A spiritual controversy about the nature of prayer is resolved into a set of practices that shape when lamps are lit and how meals are taken at certain times of year. The city loves to argue, but in these years, it loves more the ability to stop arguing and sweep streets. Power outages do not exist. Power scarcities do. They are handled by the kind of household discipline perfected in harder times. Meals prepared. To stretch, repairs done immediately to keep small problems small. Papers kept dry and in order. Money is a mirror that can make a face you know look strange. Coin debasement is a word that feels far away until you feel it in your hand. Traders learn to test and discount. Housewives learn to count and complain, pleasantly at first, then with an edge. The palace tries to set standards that can hold. In a world where the coin leaving your hand is not the same as the coin entering it next week, a new coin is minted, and for a while it sustains a pocket of confidence. But coin is promise, and promise now runs uphill against the gradient of shrinking tax bases and rising external rents. The state leans more on in-kind support, grain delivered. Instead of money paid, labor delivered instead of taxes settled. This is not failure. It is adaptation to a world that cannot honor old equivalences. Foreign quarters in the city reshape streets into languages of commerce you might not know. Bridges of habit cross the water as much as bridges of stone. A customs office does its sums with care, and those sums, increasingly, add up to the ya. Conclusion that the city's own ships cannot do without ships whose houses and warehouses lie under the protection of other flags. It is an uneasy partnership that must be tended. When quarrels turn into violence, the losses are counted on all sides and the walls wash down after. Even wounds become counters in negotiations for the next year's privileges. The bureaucratic mind is asked to remember affront and to accommodate profit. That it manages, more often than not, this moral gymnastics is another reason. The city lasts as long as it does. Civil strife is less a story of ideology than of scheduled disruption. Two factions who argue about their rights to guide the ship of state produce in the streets the same symptoms you have seen in other crises. Late bread, missed shipments, postponed payments, broken appointments. The watch continues to walk routes. The courts continue to take testimony. Monasteries add beds to their guest houses and bowls to their kitchens. In this way, citizens survive a war for thrones with the same tools they used to survive a storm. Shutters maintained, stores rotated, neighbors consulted. From a distance, a civil war looks like a map. From inside, it looks like the failure of 3 deliveries in a row dot as a new power across the water grows. It builds its own scheduling capacity, its own posts and roads and ledgers, its own series of rulers who know the value of predictable justice. They are learning the same trick the city taught the world, how to turn force into administration and administration into endurance. If you are honest, you will admit that your admiration for order is transferable. It can be practiced by other hands. You continue to practice it in your quarter because it is the only way to keep families intact. But you can feel a gravity shifting. Dependencies grow too many. Agreements grow too few. Invoices begin to come due all at once. The last siege is not remembered only for its cannon, but for its schedules. Ration lists are posted. Water points are assigned. Watch routes are doubled. The chain across the water is raised again. The city knows how to be disciplined, because discipline is the last wealth it possesses in abundance. Households ration oil and grain. Bakers thin the loaves while posting exact measures to prevent panic. Hospital kitchens stretch broth and keep the sick clean while they can, because disease in a domino city is faster than any battering ram. Priests keep hours because hours are the ark of hope. The palace keeps a desk lit because the presence of a pen reassures more than a speech. The walls, men trained to count arrows regroup by tens and fifties rather than by hopes and fears. Spare rope is kept near. Water is staged where it will be needed to douse fires. The city's last gifts are organizational. The conversion of courage into shift work, of piety into scheduled service, of grief into reasonable action on behalf of the next hour. It is not that there are no heroes. It is that heroism is absorbed into committees and duty rosters, because that is how the city has always won more time than circumstances suggested it should have. When the end comes, it is not a failure of spirit, but of mathematics. There are more holes than men, more fires than buckets, more points of attack than counter moves left. The city's habits do not save it forever. They save it for as long as any city can be saved. In the aftermath, the ledgers that are gathered and stored by new hands will carry forward the lesson that order is portable and precious. Some of the city's children will read those ledgers in new offices. Others will remember how hospitals were run, how guilds kept standards, how courts made people argue on paper instead of with blades. A civilization does not vanish when its banners are taken down. It dissolves into practices that move on. In the work of later accountants, judges, architects, chanters, and shopkeepers, you will hear echoes of a city that made time out of paper. Might be tempted, from the comfort of distance, to read this story as the slow unspooling of inevitability. That is too neat. The long dusk was full of mornings. Families arranged marriages. Workshops trained apprentices. Fields yielded grain. Ships made landfall. The capital fended off worse fates by the daily application of a skill as undramatic as sweeping a floor, keeping things in order. The lesson is not that order beats history. It is that order allows history, even unhappy history, to be born with decency. Standing in the imagined dark of the last night, you might ask yourself a simple question spoken in the city's own tone call. Practical, weary, but unbroken. In your own time, where schedules strain and promises wobble, what will you maintain, patiently and with care, so that someone else can live through a hard season and recognize in the ordinary the shape of hope?